Okay, everybody, thank you for your attendance here at the Scrutiny Committee on the 12th of June. It's the usual housekeeping rules that everybody in this room is familiar with, so I'll not go through them again. Are there any apologies for today's meeting?
Yes, Convener. We have an apology from Councillor Barnacle, and we also have an apology from Councillor McCall, with Councillor Donaldson substituting.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest?
I have a declaration of interest, Councillor Lang, in that I'm a member of the Horsecross Board, so I shall leave the room when the Horsecross items come up for discussion.
Thanks, Councillor Coates. Firstly, of the Scrutiny Committee of the 17th of April. Agreed. Thank you. Item 4, Business Gateway. This is an update of the position of the funding element for Business Gateway, where it was raised initially to this committee by Councillor Stewart, and we as a committee decided to look further into it. It transpired that not all the funding that was held by Dundee City Council for Business Gateway was finding its way through to the correct amount. So we asked the Chief Executive of Perth Kinross Council to write to Dundee to inquire about this funding issue that, thanks to Councillor Stewart's intervention, this committee had investigated. And it's come back that the Chief Executive of Dundee Council has agreed that they will this reduction in funding to Business Gateway will be reversed, taking effect from 2021. On reading this response, and my first question would be, since this has happened from 2016 or 17, does this statement mean that the money will be paid back into the fund for Business Gateway in retrospect? So I'd like to put that to Keith McNamara, who will have an update of what the current position is and the correspondence between the two chief executives.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I can confirm that. You're right in your assertion that Dundee City Council have agreed that they will reinstate that saving as of next financial year. Our own Chief Executive has written to the Chief Executive of Dundee City Council on the 24th of May, seeking clarity in terms of the funding situation in relation to the intervening years between when the decision was taken to reduce the funding and next year. At this stage, we've not had a response from Dundee City Council on that, so the matter is still ongoing, Convener.
Thanks very much, Keith. Does anybody have any questions for officers on how this is progressing? Or are they happy that we leave it with the Chief Executive and we get a report back at the September meeting? Or are there any comments on the fact that this has been ongoing since for at least 3 years? Councillor Dugan.
Thanks, Convener. I'm grateful to the efforts, as you are, of Councillor Stewart for highlighting this issue, and subsequent to that, for officers in their discussions with Dundee City Council to find an agreeable way ahead. Clearly, we've established part of that insofar as what was previous behaviour is now or previous practice, let's call it, is now no longer going to be the way that things are done in the future. However, like you, I feel it's absolutely essential that we take a retrospective approach to resolving this matter, and whilst it's very welcome that we'll no longer be subject to this attrition to the collective Tayside fund, we also will want to see compensation for those adjustments to the budget that have taken place in previous years, which I think number 3 years. So I would like officers present today to note that they understand this committee requires previous removals from that budget to be reinstated, as well as the guarantee that any future removals from the budget will not happen.
Thank you. I think I'll probably speak for the whole of the committee that we agree with Councillor Duggan's position on this. And Keith, can you make a comment that you will relay to the Chief Executive that this committee is fully behind her and expects the full monies to be reimbursed into the Business Gateway funding?
Happy to do that, Convener.
Thank you. Councillor Donaldson and Councillor Purvis.
Thanks. Just say I entirely agree with what Councillor Duggan's saying. It also does strike me this is an issue that may well or should involve the Audit Committee. This is about controls and processes, potentially. We're meant to be following the public pound, but somehow it seems that public pounds have gone elsewhere, and I think we need a full report to both committees, the figures involved, and also those funds that should have come to Perth and Kinross, have they been expended already in Dundee, and also what impact this has had on Business Gateway in Perth over the last 3-4 years. What's the opportunity cost? What are the things we could have done with the additional funding? So I certainly would request of Keith McNamara and of other council officers that if we can get a full in-depth report on this and to explain matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Purvis.
Just 2 points. The first one was there was a recent debate in the Scottish Parliament about Business Gateway and how it had been performing across Scotland in relation to the objectives that were originally set out. And one of the issues that was raised was the fact that the money wasn't ring-fenced. And there were suggestions from a number of MSPs there that in future the Scottish Government, as part of the budget allocation process, that the money for Business Gateway services should be ring-fenced. So I don't know whether, if you were agreeable and the committee's agreeable, Convener, that perhaps maybe the Scrutiny Committee here should write to the Scottish Government. I'm not sure exactly which minister would be the appropriate one to contact, saying that we think that that would be a sensible step forward, because while we welcome obviously the assurances from Dundee City Council that they won't do it on an ongoing basis, that would help that if there's ever a further breakdown of relations or anything like that, that it would be more difficult for them to take the same approach again. Yeah,
I understand what you're saying about the ring fencing, but the fact whether it's ring fenced or not is that if Dundee are in control of the budget with agreement, any changes to where the money is going could only happen or should only happen with agreement of the 3 constituent parties, which is Perth and Kinross and Angus and Dundee. And this seems to be a unilateral decision, nothing to do with the ring fence, and it's to do with a unilateral decision that wouldn't be taken out of a memorandum of understanding between the 3 councils.
I appreciate that, but I think that what we are suggesting was that any money that was reinstated is going to go back into Business Gateway services. So I think that the point still stands that yes, there is the issue of the unilateral decision by Dundee City Council, but actually if they had to put all of the money into Business Gateway, then that issue wouldn't have arisen because it would be Tayside wide.
Yeah, as my understanding, it goes to Elevator, is that correct? And then goes to yeah, so you would wish that myself or an officer from the council, well, myself would write to the Scottish Government asking that the money that goes to Elevator is ring-fenced for Business Gateway, or?
No, the money, the allocation that comes from the Scottish Government for Business Gateway services has to be spent on delivering Business Gateway services. Obviously, it's up to whichever council, obviously we're currently doing it on a Tayside-wide basis, to decide how that is delivered. Currently that's through a contract with Elevator, but it's just about ensuring that the money is spent for Business Gateway services.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do that. Is there any contrary view to writing to that effect? Okay.
And the second point was just a brief on Business Gateway, but not the specific issue. I did raise it at the last committee and just wanted to confirm that it was the intention for at some future scrutiny committee meeting to bring forward a paper looking at the wider options for Business Gateway, whether continuing on a Tayside-wide basis is sensible or what other models there are. Currently, obviously, we have the contract through Elevator, but what some of the other options are, which is obviously separate from the current issue of getting the money from, or the money not being allocated properly.
Yeah, that certainly is still the intention, and it's to have representatives of Business Gateway here as well, where we can scrutinise their performance and etc. So yeah, that will be coming to a future scrutiny committee.
Thank you.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Having raised this issue initially, I think I just wanted to thank you for indulging me with putting it on the agenda these last couple of meetings, and thank officers and the Chief Executive for pursuing the resolution of this matter. I look forward to this final point about the restitution of the previous year's money. I think what I would like to reflect on is that this is not a Perth Kinross, Angus Dundee fight. The losers in this situation have been the small and medium-sized enterprises who haven't had perhaps access to as complete a suite or range or of resources as they might otherwise have done. So it was just, I think, to reinforce the point that this raising this issue was an expression, I think, of Perth and Kinross Council's determination to be pro small and medium-sized enterprises, and it's very gratifying that we've got at least part way towards the resolution, because the end beneficiaries of that resolution will be the small and medium-sized enterprises, not just in Perth and Kinross, but across the whole of Tayside. So thank you again to yourself and to the officers for taking this forward. And just to add to what Councillor Purvis said, I think it would be useful to, or I'd like to echo that it would be useful to write to the Scottish Government requesting that the ring fencing of Business Gateway monies, and to hear back, as you've just confirmed we will do, about performance of Business Gateway, because that was the original issue that had we've sort of got sidetracked from, but we should be looking at how, I think as Councillor Donaldson was saying, the public pound performs in delivering services on behalf of the public sector, and some of those pounds are spent in Business Gateway, and we should be rightly and properly looking at how those, at following those public pounds and making sure that the best possible outcome is being achieved for small and medium-sized enterprises across Perth and Kinross and across Tayside from that investment. Thanks,
Councillor Stewart. I think everybody in the committee will concur with what you said. That the main concern here is that the end user is able to use the funds that were intended for them. So thank everybody who in the committee who has taken part in the debate, and we'll get an update hopefully with a positive outcome at the next meeting. So thanks. More comments or questions on? Okay, paper 5 is the Business Management Improvement Plan for the Housing and Environment Committee. Now this paper's already been in the Housing Communities Committee on the 15th of May. It was also at the Environment and Infrastructure Committee on the 15th of May. So many of you will have attended both these committees, but it's now in front of the Scrutiny Committee. If there's any questions that you would like answered now, I'll let Barbara Renton introduce the report, and then we'll have questions for Barbara.
Thank you, Convener. I've no real intention of doing an overly long introduction to our Business Management Improvement Plan and Annual Performance Report, but just to say that, you know, sort of this is the first full combined one for the Housing and Environment Service. And what we've tried to do is lay out, you know, sort of in as clear a way as possible, all the successes that we've had over the last year, but equally, you know, sort of be very clear about what we believe are our next steps and improvement actions for that. Keith and I, as you know, sort of the director and the deputy director, along with our senior management team colleagues, are very proud of the work that has been done over the course of the last year. One, in terms of service delivery, but two, in terms of actually creating a new service and having a very clear shared set of outcomes and vision for what is still a relatively new service. And I think that that was reflected both in both the committees that you referred to, Convener, in relation to both housing and the former environment service aspects of our work. And I think that this was displayed last night at the Designing Futures Together, you know, sort of where, yet again, you know, sort of the combined service, you know, sort of was the recipient of a number of awards for which we are really pleased to see the dedication and work of our staff recognised. Thank you. We're happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Barbara. So we'll open up to questions from the floor. Who's the first one? There's Councillor Illingworth.
Thank you, Convener. Can I turn to page 21 of 202, and it's about the Council's West Bank site. You talk about modern, I'll just wait till everybody gets to the page, it's 21 of 202. And I'm just wanting to know how many modern apprenticeships are being offered in horticultural, and how many young people who have disengaged at school are taking part in activities at the site.
Thanks. That might be for Barbara and maybe
yes, if you bear
somebody from
with
education.
Me, I do have that information. Right, so we have 16 school pupils, 12 under 25s, 19 over 25s, and 4 modern apprentices based at West Bank. And on top of that, we've got our 4 modern apprentice horticulturists who work as a roaming squad, you know, sort of as part of our Friarton workforce as well.
Right, thank you very much for that.
Councillor Coates.
On page 37, at the top of the table, there is, as a result of the withdrawal from the EU with no deal, there is a risk of economic downturn in a reduction in house building, business investment and everything else. Can I ask what this is based upon?
In what terms do you mean? What is based on? What the risk is based on, Councillor Coates? Okay. Barbara or Keith? We'll not be able to get spare parts for that either, because they're coming from the EU.
Oh yeah, sounds working now.
Oh, here we go. Right. I'm back. a very poor Arnold Schwarzenegger impression. Okay, thank you. You know, sort of the information, you know, sort of is from a number of well-documented risks around no deal, and, you know, sort of the fact that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government had stood up at the time of writing of this report their resilience measures as a result of the potential of a no-deal EU exit. So, and it was also as a result of information and a request that we'd had from the Council as well a number of months ago in terms of our preparation and our risks round about that.
Do you have anything to add to that, Keith?
Thank you. Yes, as Barbara Renton has mentioned, the basis for this is a significant uncertainty, and uncertainty still obviously exists, but there has been a significant number of reports published which highlight the potential risks of Brexit, with no deal Brexit being regarded in these reports as the highest risk in terms of potential impact on the economy. These reports have come from the Scottish Government directly through, as Barbara was mentioning, the Scottish Resilience Partnership and agencies such as the Scottish Enterprise, through Audit Scotland, which asked local authorities to be prepared for the impacts of Brexit, including a multiple point checklist of Brexit preparedness summaries. The UK Government, via the Treasury and the Department for Exiting the EU, and indicating independent commentators such as the Bank of England, the Fraser of Allender Institute and the Institute for Government. The vast majority of the reports and economic projections suggest Brexit will harm economic growth. These vary depending on the different assumptions and largely under 5 key factors: trade barriers, foreign direct investment, migration, regulatory framework and productivity. And I think it's symbolic of the nature of uncertainty that, as Barbara was highlighting, there was significant input into resilience, and we have been prepared for daily reports into the Scottish Government Office for Resilience with a significant loading of local resilience, both at Tayside and at national level, to be prepared for the risks around EU exit, and that's why we consider this to be the substantive risk which was identified in the Business Management and Improvement Plan.
Thanks. I don't want this to go down the line of being a football. It's a statement from the officers of an unknown being a risk. With the pros and cons of Brexit, we could argue that all day, and I know I don't think the Scrutiny Committee, which will work as a bipartisan committee, is the point where we're going to try and score political points over something that we're not really going to influence to a great deal. So I think the officers are right to have it down as a risk, because anything that we don't know the outcome, or we don't know what's happening in the future, is obviously a risk to everybody moving forward. So if there's other comments to be made, if the committee wants to agree to not make it a ping pong about no deal Brexit or that.
Oh, that's better. I'm not wishing to bang it backwards and forwards. It's just the fact that it was put down as a probability of 5 is almost certain. Certainly politically down south, it's not certain. So that if that had been too likely or possible, it wouldn't have put it as so high.
No, but it's not talking about the probability of a no deal. It's talking about, if there is a no deal, the risk. So, it's the risk, I would say, is pertaining only to Perth and Kinross, which which will have a different set of criteria that will add up from other areas in the UK. So I think the officers have come up with what they think is a fair assessment.
Can I just, on the point about that, not specifically in relation to no deal or any of the other points, but in just in terms of how you calculate the residual risk, is the impact is the inherent score that you give to it if the thing were to happen, where the probability is the score of whether or not the thing is going to happen. That's how it works, isn't it? So I think I would agree with Chris's assessment of 5 being the major one, then critical, that it's it's not necessarily absolute.
You're correct. The combined inherent risk score is based on probability and the impact if that then happened. And then you factor in what your controls might be and how that can mitigate against some of the risk factors. The reason I think that was put down at 5 at that particular point is because there was nothing else. There was no other timescales. There was no other. At this moment in time, we're working in a vacuum in that there's nothing else there. So you're working on the basis that in the absence of anything else, the probability is it's a no deal. That would be fluid. If we suddenly had another flurry of negotiations or something else was to change or something else was put on the table that was accepted, then that probability would go up or down, dependent. The problem that we have here is that we're working in a vacuum with very little information about this in terms of the likelihood of where the politicians will go with this. So therefore we need to then make an assumption on what do we do in a worst case scenario. And obviously as more information comes in, that can be reassessed and that risk score can go down.
I really don't want to spend a lot of time discussing this. I'll give you another go of it, but there's other, to my mind, the one underneath it is a more important score of 15 when we're talking about less funding for people who need it, and it's something that can be within our control.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I'm conscious that this has been gone over a number of times, both at full council and at various other committees. But we've also had, and I think it's worth just diverting Mr McNamara back from resilience onto the point of the question here, which is about a prosperous, inclusive and sustainable economy. The score that has been given here is high, 20. The risk of an economic downturn as a result of no-deal exit from the EU. But I think it's worth also reflecting that a couple of members' briefing sessions ago up in the Civic Lounge, and these are ones which are not videoed and not put on YouTube or minuted for the access to the public, in response to a very helpful question from Councillor Dugan, the response of officers was that in terms of a no-deal exit, exiting the EU on World Trade Organization terms actually potentially also there's a flip side, which is that it opens up the world's markets to businesses in Perth and Kinross, and that that indeed businesses were being supported to look at wider international markets and to work through the issues, in terms of tariffs and so on, and that proactive action has been taken to support small and medium-sized enterprises and indeed our larger businesses, although they are probably inherently more stable and ready to deal with these issues, but to support the small and medium-sized enterprises to access the potentially wider and larger and more lucrative international markets that could open up following the exit from the European Union. I think it's remiss of us not to reflect on both sides of the coin, and I just wanted to make that point because I know that this issue has come up before, but not here.
I think I've been quite fair, and there's colleagues probably from the other side of the argument wanting to bring their part forward. I'm going to draw a veil on it. I think I've been quite fair, and we can maybe agree to disagree with each other and the officers. Some of you may disagree with that as well, but we'll move on, I think. Is there any other are there any other questions in the paper? I'll go to Councillor McEwen.
Thank you, Convener. On page 38 of the report, there's a statistics regarding emissions from council properties in tonne CO2. And we've had a 25% reduction in our emissions, which is obviously, I think, very, very, very good. But it also means we're actually outstripping our targets for the future. So the question I have is, are targets for the future going to be realigned with our successes?
Thanks, Councillor McEwen. What page was that on again?
52 of 38 is the second statistic on the table.
Thanks. Would that be Keith or Barbara? It's on page 52 of 102. Of
30, 50.
52 of the committee's report, 38 of your.
It's not helped that I'm using an earlier version of the report as well. I'm using the committee versions that I had and not the scrutiny committee. So I think that, you know, sort of, we continue to monitor, you know, sort of, and take a very proactive, you know, sort of approach to our carbon emissions. And we will be continuing to look at what our targets are and reflect that accordingly. Yeah. And that's, you know, sort of, if you look at the second one, you know, sort of across the piece, you know, sort of, we are looking to have, you know, sort of by 2021-22, our carbon emission target of 12,000 tonnes as opposed to, you know, sort of the 14 and a half that we had in 18-19. But I accept what you're saying, that, you know, sort of, now that we're almost at that 12,000, is there more that we can, lower that we can go? Yeah.
I've got another few questions throughout the papers, that's okay?
Okay, just go through them.
Right, so the next one I have is on page 17 of the report, which I think is 31 of our documents. And it regards the rollout of electrical charging stations, in which we get financial support from Transport Scotland to do that. I just wanted a bit more detail on what percentage of the funding for that is Transport Scotland and what percentage of that funding is us.
It's 100% for the actual charging points at the moment, and I think we no longer get the full amount in terms of the actual usage, the electricity usage. And a couple of years ago, we put that in as a budget pressure, which the council accepted.
My next question was around page 10 of the report. And it's regarding the R100 programme. And I know we're currently out to consultation for bidders on that. I just wondered if there's any update that's suitable for this committee regarding the R100.
We are expecting to have information back probably, you know, sort of over the course of the summer in terms of the contract. It's still to be let, you know, sort of, and until that, the information's gone out, then we're not able to do a full update, but we will whenever we can.
And my last question, which actually even came up on the radio when I was driving in this morning on Radio 5 Live, is regarding gas central heating. And obviously, over the last few years, the council spent a lot of time fitting gas central heating into properties that who previously only had electricity as a source of heating, which is obviously quite expensive. But as we move forward with the climate emergency, the advice is to replace gas heaters in people's houses. So I just wondered what the council's approach to that now going to be, sudden the sort of carpet's been pulled from under our feet.
I think, you know, sort of, I'm not sure, you know, sort of about the carpet being pulled from under our feet, you know, sort of, we still have to have, you know, sort of other renewable sources for that, you know, sort of, but we are, you know, sort of committed to finding what they can be. But at the moment, you know, sort of in terms of gas, then it is much more effective for our tenants, and that, you know, continues at the moment to be the best solution for us, but we are looking at all other alternatives.
Thank you. Councillor Parrott.
Thank you, Convener. At Enterprise and, Environment and Infrastructure Committee, I raised a concern with regard to the measuring of the working age population unemployed and the lack of measurements relating to unfilled vacancies. And I was wondering if Mr McNamara might briefly comment on how that concern's being taken forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the point revolves around very low unemployment rates within Perth and Kinross, which is good news in some respects, but obviously puts pressure on employers, particularly in hard-to-fill employment areas. We track that level of concern or any issues within the businesses through various sources such as the Employment Hub or Perth Chamber of Commerce, and also through the interactions our colleagues have. We recognise from what Councillor Parrott was saying at the E&I committee that is there a sort of opportunity to do some sort of almost like monitoring or tracking of the degree of lacking of uptake of jobs, particularly in key sectors which do have employment issues. At an officer level, we feel that to do that to every business in these sectors is quite resource intensive, and it would divert us away from doing other activities. However, we do recognise that there's a opportunity to almost be take a selection of businesses and do almost like a barometer check with these businesses, which has a dual benefit. It's a kind of quasi-numerical opportunity to look at the state of the nation in terms of these businesses' recruitment and selection issues, but also it's a great opportunity to link in with these businesses and offer the different levels of support that are available through the council and our partners. So we're happy to take that one forward. Convener.
Thank you, Arch.
Do we have any other questions on the report? Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Two questions. On page 25 of the BMIP, or page 39 of our document pack, the last point under delivering a prosperous, inclusive and sustainable economy, just to check, this is question one, sorry, there's a different question on a completely different subject, but just to check, the examination of the local development plan by the Scottish Government's reporter, that it seems to me that timescale has slipped. I thought we were expecting it some time sort of in the first half of the year rather than sort of in the third quarter. Am I correct in that, or?
I haven't heard that there has been any significant, sort of delay, but can I come back to you on that?
Thank you. And then if I flipped over to page 28 of the BMIP, page 42 of our document pack, just to check the Dundee and Angus Council Road Network Street Works Traffic Signal Management, did that agreement proceed? I thought it had, if it was an agreement with external parties, it would have been SPNR that would have reviewed, entered into that agreement rather than Environment and Infrastructure Committee. But I just wanted to double check that that had happened, and if so, did it go to our officers certain that it was considered by the correct committee as per the scheme of administration and standing orders?
In terms of being part of the transformational activities, I think the overall transformation activities would, I think you're right, Councillor Stewart, appropriately go to strategic policy and resources. Because this was an operational matter, officers felt this was something which should be addressed as an operational matter through the Environment and Infrastructure Committee, and that was a committee which approved the activity. And just to perhaps fill in the second part of your point there, the partnership was launched on the 1st of May of this year.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question here. It's on page 39 of 202, and it's the first one under independent, healthy and active life. I was just wondering, the second point down in the third box was to continue to monitor the impact of universal credit and undertake analysis. Will there be a report coming to a committee when this analysis is completed, or is there an ongoing report saying this was the timescale was for delivery was the 31st of March?
We have continued to update the executive officer team with that, but we are more than happy to bring a report probably with our welfare benefits colleagues in terms of the impact, generally of universal credit.
Thanks. Councillor Ahern.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's on page 48 of 202. It's the figures for the Perth City Centre footfall and the vacant retail units in the Perth City Centre. I notice there's been a reduction in vacant units, which obviously means we've got more retail units in the city centre, but there's a huge dramatic fall in the footfall. I just wondered how we measured that, and do we know why there's been a dramatic decrease in footfall, although we've had more businesses apparently coming into the city centre?
That's actually the percentage above the national level, so it just means it doesn't look as dramatic. It's not fallen by a fifth. It just maybe means that.
But if you look at the previous years, it was 9.2 above, 5.8, and now it's dropped down to 1.9. So there's a decrease in footfall. And our empty businesses, vacant businesses have gone down. So we've got more businesses in the city centre, but we've got less footfall in the city centre now.
No, it doesn't mean that the footfall has gone down, because I remember this question came at this committee. It means that the average of other cities has maybe risen and ours has stayed the same, but I'll give it to the officers.
Obviously, I wasn't in E&I, so I wasn't aware of that.
That was the figure at February 2019. The March full figure for the year was 5.9%. So again, we're sort of maintaining the figure from 17-18.
Thank you.
Councillor Coates.
I would, being a city centre business owner, I would disagree with Councillor Ahern, and it's plain to see that the number of empty units in the city centre is increasing, and it's increasing quite quickly. There are so many big units and so many worrying prospects coming up that some of the bigger firms are going to disappear, and that will leave the city centre bereft of shops.
Councillor, do we have a response? Does anybody want to?
I think, sort of, if we all had control, absolute control over, sort of how retail was going to progress, then, sort of, again, sort of, we would be much further ahead. However, that is one of the reasons for the town centre, or the city centre actual action group, sort of to look at how we address what is still a very, very strong position that Perth is in compared to the national situation, but it's also then to look ahead to see what else we can do. And I understand that the first meeting of that group took place probably about a fortnight ago, and a lot of very good ideas. So we are well ahead.
Thanks. We're kind of blurring between comment and questions here. So we're still on questions. So, Councillor Dugan.
Yeah, I'll come back to you on comments, Convener.
I think we'll just move to comments if everybody's happy. So we'll just come back. Is it a comment or a question?
It's a comment.
Comment.
It's I don't wish to correct, and I'm not correcting my ward colleague Councillor Coates, but it's for others to deal in perception and anecdote, and it's for us to deal in facts. And officers aren't making this up. The measures that are contained in the reports that come before us are based on fact and evidence, and when they say something, unless we can prove it otherwise, we accept it as fact. And like all of us here, we realise there are challenges in our towns and city centres, but we should acknowledge how well Perth city centre in particular, and retail centres like Blair Gowrie and Pitlochry are performing. We don't need to go too far outside Perth and Kinross to see really challenging economic centres. So we should acknowledge when things are going well and accept that. And the efforts of elected members in both in city wards and elsewhere, combined with officers, to make sure that Perth fends off as far as possible the difficult prevailing economic conditions that affect retail. That's the responsibility of all of us. So whilst we might think there is an increase, unless we can actually prove that our thoughts are based in fact and at odds with what officers are telling us, then we need to accept what officers are putting forward and be very careful about any assessment that they're not based in fact, because if we lose that trust, which I haven't, then we're in difficult territory.
Thanks for that Point well made. Councillor Rilling.
Thank you. Just a general comment about the whole report. There's an awful lot of really good news stories, and I think this evidences that housing and environment are really improving the way of life for people in Perth and Kinross. So thank you for all your hard work and great results.
Thanks for that. I think there are a lot of good news stories, and it's down to a lot of hard work by people here, but by a lot of people behind the scenes that we never see. So I'd like you to take that back to these people, because they're the most, don't mean to undermine you, but they're the ones facing forward most, and it would be good if you could pass out this committee's thanks back to them.
We'd be delighted to, and thank you for those comments.
Thanks. If there are no more comments, we'll move on to the next paper. This paper is a BMIP again. It's the Education and Children's Services BMIP and Annual Performance Report. This paper has been to Lifelong Learning on the 22nd of May, and some of you will have had your chance to scrutinise it there. You may want to take the chance to ask further questions here today. So I'll ask Sheena Devlin if she would introduce the report, and then we'll open it. Oh, it's Jackie Pepper to introduce the report, and then we can move to questions.
Thank you, Convener. This is the Joint Business Management and Improvement Plan for Education and Children's Services, which now includes in full from this year criminal justice social work services. And the report summarises performance over the past year and provides a positive picture overall and steady improvement across a number of key indicators. And in similar comment to the Executive Director of Housing and Environment, I think it was very pleasing to see last night at the Designing the Future Awards the sheer number and quality of entries from across education and children's services, and along with partners making it through to that ceremony last night. And for those of you who were there, a real opportunity to see firsthand many of the areas of work at team level, which are also reflected in this report and contributing to the performance that you have before you today. Two matters I would like to draw your attention to is that we've produced a one-page schematic paper which provides a simple and easy to understand summary of the whole report. So we're grateful to colleagues and our performance team for providing that. I would also like to commend you to our intention to hold a briefing session on the 2nd of October for elected members from the Lifelong Learning Committee and Scrutiny Committee, along with those who are involved in the Community Justice Partnership, which Councillor Ahern chairs, and really to look at a bit more detail behind the work of the Criminal Justice Social Work Services, and we've already confirmed attendance and some key contributions from people who have direct experience of the justice system. So I'd commend that to you on the 2nd of October.
Thank you, Sheena. Thanks for that. And I know it's Jackie. Yes. I was just thinking of an excuse that Lisa gave earlier on, and I thought that excuse isn't going to do for me for my memory going. But we'll not go into that excuse. So we'll now move on to. Do we have any questions? Councillor Purvis.
Thank you, Convener. My question's on the Tayside Regional Improvement Collaborative. Obviously, throughout the BMIP and in the plan that you have and the actions peppered throughout it are lots of instances where regional collaboration has been undertaken. Now, as many people probably know, I'm quite sceptical of that as an initial starting point. I think that certainly looking through it, it looks that it's very time and resource intensive for us to be involved with these things. I'm also still concerned as to why the focus is solely on Tayside. I know we do work with other, it's not to say we don't work with other local authorities, and I wouldn't suggest that, but why the explicit Regional Improvement Collaborative has been set up on that basis. The Scottish Government couldn't get their education bill through the Scottish Parliament because it didn't have the sufficient support for these proposals, and I'm concerned that we're essentially doing the work of those proposals that weren't able to get through voluntarily. So I suppose just to distill my question into something more manageable, what are the benefits to Perth and Kinross of regional collaboration that we could not achieve on our own, and why does it need to be done explicitly with this model on a Tayside-wide basis rather than ad hoc collaboration or information sharing with local authorities across Scotland?
Thank you very much for your question, Councillor Purvis. I think there was a previous meeting of the Lifelong Learning Committee where we brought an update on the progress against the Tayside Children's Services Plan, where we had representation from NHS Tayside in particular, but also from Police Scotland, where the collaboration in relation to Tayside is particularly important for those two key partners in terms of taking forward our improvement activity across children's services in particular. I'm not sure if Roger and Sharon want to say anything from an education perspective.
Thank you, Councillor Purvis. In terms of your question about what's the benefit in terms of the collaborative, I think in terms of the collaborative, in fact, we've just come from a trick day today, which is being held, which is bringing together school leaders from across the three areas. And there we're seeing a much more collaborative approach. We're seeing access to resource and access to I suppose, expertise that maybe we can't tap into at times. We do have it within our organisation. So therefore, we've had a range of collaborative days on numeracy, on digital learning, and on learning and teaching, where we've been sharing across the three authorities. And I think in terms of, we're seeing it as part of our actual daily work. This is the work that we would be doing normally, and we're just tapping into other partners to provide us with a wider spread of opportunities to improve our practice. In terms of where did it come from, we previously, prior to the setting up of the trick, we were working across those three local authorities, as well as Fife, North Fife as well, before they moved on to work with the Edinburgh and Borders area. So we have, over a period of time, been working with a loose grouping of local authorities.
Councillor Purvis, have you?
So it's really just to add to that in terms of the priority groups. Both Sharon and I are leads for 2 of the 5 priority groups. And I think from my own experience and perspective, there's an opportunity within that to share resource and capacity. So instead of doing a particular piece of work 3 times and doing that differently, we're able to share our resources and complete that task together across the 3 local authority areas and with our partners in police and health. And I'm particularly thinking of some of the progress that we've made around child protection, key practice and process areas.
Sharing microphone. I lead the pre-birth and early years group, Councillor Purvis, and I suppose one of the biggest benefits that we've received from our Tayside collaboration is approximately £150,000 worth of funding, which has allowed us to pull together a coordinator for a piece of work which is going to take participants who all workers from education, NHS, social work, third sector, to train in the Solihull approach, which is a relationship-based approach to working with children and families, and that's going to be across the whole of Tayside. One of the other bits of funding that has come from that is a Test of Change, which is a project that's going to happen only in Perth and Kinross, and that's about the development of a welfare rights worker to work with all pregnant women within Perth and Kinross to see if there's an impact on their ability to take up their entitlements to benefits. And while that's a Tayside approach, it's happening in Perth and Kinross this year, and we're trialling that on behalf of Tayside Region. So there are two, I suppose, tangible benefits from that group.
Thank you for your answers. Can I just ask a few supplementaries on the basis of the responses? I think, Jackie, it's easier to grasp it for something like the Children, Young People and Families Plan, where you have NHS Tayside, and that is the Territorial Health Board that we have. And obviously there is collaboration between the councils and the Health Board when it comes to things like the Integration Joint Board as well. So I think that's slightly easier for me to understand the rationale for that. I suppose more when we're looking at explicitly going into primary education and secondary education, which you've touched on as well in your answers. I suppose why aren't we looking to, and I know it's this distinction, because clearly there is a distinction between more informal ad hoc information sharing and best practice sharing and a regional improvement collaborative, because it is a distinct entity that we have set up for a specific purpose. Why we aren't looking to work with councils that are on a more similar in terms of rurality, or that are in higher quartiles in terms of their performance in examination results or things like that. Why? Because other than for the NHS Tayside region doesn't exist anymore, and but I think that we're still feel whether that's through the Scottish Government's intentions or history, as it has been in the council, that the default must be. Sorry, that's Siri going off. The default must be Tayside. And I think that that's still something that I don't quite understand what the benefit to us is. And also, could I ask about the £150,000? Is that direct from the Scottish Government, or has that been pulled from the various constituent authorities?
To try and answer the first part of your question in terms of why do we not work with other authorities, we do. The reason that we work with the Tayside region are two reasons. The first one is because of the educational reform, and therefore within education we have had funding, and the Scottish Government and Education Scotland are organising themselves around regional collaboratives, and therefore that's one of the reasons that we work in that way. And the benefits of that are the funding. So the second question you asked was where that funding came from. It did actually come from the Scottish Government, and it's there to support collaboration across education, and that has included for us early years. The ways that we work with other authorities, though, is a good question. And when it's about school improvement in primary education and early years education, we have, and have had for a very long time, a long-standing arrangement to work with other local authorities depending on the areas that we want to improve. But the way we do that on a routine basis is through the ADES group, which is the Association of Directors of Education. And all of us, the heads of service and quite a lot of quality improvement officers, go to meet with all other local authorities on a national basis to share practice. We've also had individual, I suppose, relationships with local authorities where we've seen good practice or something that fits with our own practice. The most recent example of that would be Renfrewshire Council. Renfrewshire Council was a Scottish Attainment Challenge Authority that has just been recently inspected on how well it improved the lives of children and young people as a result of the Attainment Challenge funding. And in Perth and Kinross, we have been working with them over a period of months, because there are very similar arrangements in place within Renfrewshire that fit with Perth and Kinross. So we have been working with them on some of the things that we want to do to improve attainment, and using the lessons learned from that authority. So it's not that we don't work with other local authorities, but the reasons that we work with Tayside are for those reasons, the organisational reasons, but also we share populations and practice, and the Dundee is a challenge authority. There are things that we have learned from the Dundee experience that we can take into Perth and Kinross. And similarly, we have good practice in Perth and Kinross that we want to share. But across the whole of the population, we do see a benefit. You're quite right, it does take time and effort to do it. But our head teachers in our schools have really given us very positive feedback from the opportunities that they've had on a geographical basis to be going and visiting other schools in Angus and Dundee, because they know their head teacher colleagues in Perth and Kinross quite well. So from feedback from our stakeholders, it's certainly seen as a positive experience.
Thanks. Any further questions? Councillor McEwen, then Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Convener. Two of our strategic objectives in lifelong learning is learning and attainment and health and well-being. And I think one of the big players into that is the cost of the school day. You know, and part of that, the biggest cost for kids going to school is their uniforms. Increasing uniform wearing, reducing the difference of stigma, develops happier children. They're ready to learn and with a sense of belonging to the school. And as a whole, that increases the participation in their learning and the participation of their parents with the school as well. So that all leads to greater attainment, etc. The Lifelong Learning Committee recently passed a paper approving the clothing and footwear grant to the minimum set by the Scottish Government. But obviously that committee, we didn't discuss the other mechanisms by which school clothing can be got for hard-pressed families. Okay. And therefore the question I have is, what actions are the Council taking to help hard-working families and the children that we've identified now in poverty towards gaining the school uniform and all these benefits other than the school grant that we've offered?
Jackie, would you take that
Yeah.
one up? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. I'd like to draw your attention to page 48, that's page 110 out of 202, where we're indicating as we move forward in this year, supporting the development of the Perth and Kinross Child Poverty Action Plan. And there are a number of actions in there that we intend to take forward, which relate directly to the point that you're raising there. If there's any more detail that you would like in relation to those, I can ask Roger and Sharon to give you more detail if required.
So in terms of the school clothing, we're looking to work with the welfare rights team to identify, rather than opt-in to school uniform, to uptake of school clothing entitlement, is actually to reach out, because we have the data within the welfare rights team, to actually reach out and then go straight to families to say, have you taken up your entitlement and allowance in terms of this? So that's part of it. So there's a step forward in that way, but also then we'll also look at the cost of the school day, and there's a group working on that at this period of time, is to look at other ways in which we might consider, whether it be clothing banks, that sort of thing, which are used in other local authorities, to find other ways to recycle school uniform in a way that's doesn't give a stigma to those people who are accessing those clothing banks.
Maybe just turn it to the side. Last year we had a really interesting session with our Parent Council Chairs Network, Councillor McEwen, which was to talk about the cost of the school day with our parent councils. We had quite a good discussion with them about what their role might be in that. And part of that is about parental views and expectations about what the cost of the school day should be like. And we talked about school uniforms, the range of trips that children would go for, and we got some very good ideas from our Parent Council Chairs Network about how they as a parent council could support that. And our schools have been working with parents to think about the most cost-effective way, first of all, to get school uniform. So where and how we could commission good school clothing, but at a cheaper price than you would maybe have expected in the past. So that's been a really good piece of work. Schools themselves have also done an awful lot to be reducing the stigma about, like doing replacement uniforms. So Pitlochry High School has been incredibly successful. They've been doing that for many years, where it's perfectly reasonable and normal for parents to hand in school clothing at the end of a school year that their children have outgrown but can still be used, and give that to the school, and it's an open policy for parents to come and swap school clothing, and that is well taken up by parents, and that's something that other schools are also doing as well in terms of their practice.
Supplementary on that. What control do we, as a central council, compared to the individual schools, have over the policies of school uniform? Obviously, some schools have blazers, some don't have blazers, and et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. In terms of schools will make up their own policies. However, school uniform is not compulsory. So therefore, if it comes down to a requirement to have blazers, well, there shouldn't be a requirement to have blazers. There's a kind of minimum standard of uniform. All children will have a uniform level, but I say school uniform is not compulsory, so therefore there shouldn't be a requirement on individuals to actually appear in school uniform. Although we would recommend it as much as it can be done.
Councillor Stewart was next, then Councillor Dugan.
Thanks, Convener. Questions on two different themes, I think. First of all, I'd like to just pursue further a little the line of questioning that Councillor Purvis was pursuing earlier. I think when I was first elected a councillor and appointed to the Scrutiny Committee, one of my very first questions in this chamber was why Tayside? So I'd just like to take that a bit further. I'm still having difficulty understanding, given, as Councillor Purvis points out, that there is no national legislation mandating the formation of regional improvement collaboratives, and that when we look at a variety of other areas, for example, the community plan, we can talk about geographical communities, but we can also talk about communities of interest. So if we were talking about a regional improvement collaborative, it might mean a region of community of interest rather than a geographical region of shared interest. So given that, and given the opportunity, the only thing I think I've heard in terms of the benefits of the Regional Improvement Collaborative is the opportunity for head teachers from Perth Kinross to go and learn and share experiences with head teachers in Angus and Dundee. But that could equally be the case if they had gone to Clackmannanshire or Stirling or Aberdeen or Aberdeenshire or Moray or any of our other neighbouring local authorities. So what benefits does the Regional Improvement Collaborative bring that could not otherwise be delivered or achieved?
I suppose going back to the original point, there are still two imperatives as to why Tayside region. The first one, which preceded the education regional improvement collaboratives, is the fact that Tayside shares a national health service and a health board. And in terms of a children's services plan, each local authority within that region and that NHS board have a statutory duty to prepare children's plans. So we see a clear benefit in one NHS board, which has statutory responsibility for a children's services plan across 3 local authorities, doing that in conjunction with all 3 local authorities. And that's because we've had very good working relationships with our partners in Dundee and Angus already. And there are benefits to having close relationships with our close geographical partners. But the clear benefits around the Children's Services Plan is because we share the statutory responsibility with one board, and therefore there are benefits within that. In terms of the Regional Improvement Collaborative, there is no legislation, but there is an organisational arrangement made within education that we are bound to support. And what I would say is that we are seeing clear benefits to that Tayside regional collaboration in the form of the organisational structure that comes with it, So there's additional support and funding that comes through the regional improvement collaboratives from Education Scotland and from the Scottish Government in the form of curriculum advisors, scrutiny advisors, attainment advisors from the Scottish Government, who all work within that regional improvement collaboration. So that's really helpful for us to be part of that. And the other part of it is it's not just head teachers who welcome that support. The research around system improvement talks very clearly about the fact that if we're going to make improvement within the education system, it has to be at practitioner level, and that's through teachers. We are able to do more as a regional collaborative through head teachers and the leadership across Tayside to support our practitioners to share that practice, because while it might be easy for head teachers to collaborate in communities of interest, and they do, it's not so easy organisationally to do that for teachers and practitioners. And one of the benefits that we've had around our Tayside collaboration is that we've had a number of events, the one today that Roger Hill, my colleague, mentioned, and a couple of other conferences which have actually been held on Saturdays. And vast numbers of our teachers have gone to those events for digital technologies and numeracy. And again, our feedback from that is that our teachers and our head teachers are finding that very useful. It's not to say, though, that communities of interest are not still happening. So although we are working on an organisational level with Tayside Regional Improvement Collaborative for our education, and we're working across the NHS board for our children's plans, individual schools are still having interests and communities of interest, and we've got numbers of our schools who actually do have partner schools from Clickmannshire, from Stirling, from Fife, and from other areas, and that still takes place, and that's really helpful. But that's on an individual school basis. And I suppose what the difference is that when you work across 3 local authorities, you can take broader areas of improvement and move at a greater pace because of the scale.
I think really just to add, when the Tayside Children's Services Plan was developed for 17 to 20, there was a huge amount of activity in advance of that. So the collaboration around the priorities that are identified within that plan was about those areas in which we shared a concern or shared a need for improvement, and that that was developed across the 3 local authority areas with partners. So the focus of the plan are on those areas where we share a need for improvement. It's not just for collaboration's sake.
Okay, I'm still I'm really struggling to understand what benefits accrue to us through the regional improvement collaboration model that could not accrue to us through other models or other collaborations of choice. I would actually disagree with Councillor Purvis about it's obvious that you know, in terms of the parenting strategy or the young person strategy that's required from NHS Tayside, that we should then follow an NHS Tayside model for that, because you have 3 integration authorities working with and local authorities working with NHS Tayside. But I don't think that we should necessarily drive all of our educational improvement on the basis of the NHS's organisational and regional local structure. That's not. It might be convenient, but it's not the way around.
I think you've had an answer to the question, yeah, and I understand your concerns, and I think you maybe need more convincing or not. And I would maybe think that the officers would be quite happy to set up a meeting for yourself and with anybody else who wished to go along with you, and you could thrash it out in further detail if you would wish that. Would the officers be happy to?
Okay. Can I pick up a different thread? This will be a much simpler question then, which is on page 37 of the BMIP, or page 99 of our document packs, just in relation to the digital strategy. So I'd previously, I think, had correspondence with Mr. Hill about the virtual campus, and I just wanted to get evaluation of progress to date. The second point there is March 2019, and a report was submitted to the senior management team in April 2019 This is on implementing the digital strategy, and then implementing the digital virtual campus across a number of settings. June 2019. I was particularly keen to find out because I think when we spoke about it before, Mr. Hill, there was one pupil who'd actually experienced that digital campus, and I just wanted to know if we'd gone further than that and what the results were and how we were planning to take that forward.
So at the moment we're working with eSchool to work on at least one subject area of higher computing across a number of schools, and therefore by the end of June there'll be a further report, implementation report we submitted to ECS SMT to say how we'll roll this out across over the next year or so. We're also looking at putting in dedicated resource, so subsuming it into the actual staffing quota that we have to actually support the digital learning strategy, and that will be picked up from August as well. So we'll have dedicated officer support for that, which will be part of the complement to support this moving forward, and we'll bring in an expert to do that. So there is work ongoing, continue to be work ongoing. There's a further report to SMT by the end of this month.
And in terms of reports to councillors, or in terms of if you can answer just now about how many pupils have benefited or trialled this, or you know, when it will be rolled out more widely?
Don't have the exact numbers of the pupils. I say it's a higher computing course at the moment, has been worked through eSchool, and we're looking at how we roll that out further to other areas. But it's also linked into also considerations about rural schooling and how we access the resources and subjects across a range of rural schools. So that's all part of the mix, and we are also looking at that in terms of the Highland Perthshire model as well. We're looking at this time. And I say we're receiving strong support from eSchool, which is a well-organised system to support digital learning and virtual learning across a number of sites.
Okay, thank you. I think it's just worth noting that, you know, obviously we have a huge rural area in Perth Kinross. The potential benefits in terms of individual pupils being able to access courses that they might not otherwise have you know, might not otherwise be best use of resources to provide local teaching for that. I think all of the councillors from the rural wards would certainly be very supportive of making sure that this was progressed with some alacrity.
Thank you. Councillor Dugan.
Is Councillor Stewart finished, convener? And is it still June? Very valid.
I was going to ask the same question until they gave up and just gave him the answer he wanted.
Very valid points, everyone. Can I ask initially, please, a supplementary on one of the responses that was given to Councillor McEwen on the cost of school day? I'm very interested to learn what's happening in Pitlochry. It seems to me, and you know, the stigma element of it will be, as far as I can assess, a real hurdle. But I wonder if officers or if schools individually have chosen to include the environmental benefits of making better use of clothing of rapidly growing children, because it seems to me that that would be a helpful way to put any latent stigma in the shade and say you're doing your bit for the planet as well as household budgets. Is that something that's been looked at or considered?
Councillor Dugan, that's exactly one of the ways in which Pitlochry have actually done that, because it has been a piece of work over a number of years to reduce that stigma around you know, picking up clothes, and that was only for the people who couldn't afford it, etc., etc. And the head teacher, Elaine Liney, talked very eloquently at a meeting that we had in Pitlochry about the range of ways that they have done that, and obviously looking after the environment and climate change, etc., has all been part of that. So it has gone a long way into changing that culture and that mindset. So actually it's a good thing if you do the swap rather than you buy new clothes, and it's one of the, I suppose, the biggest influencers in terms of that change in culture.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think if we could embed that, convener, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it's a very good way of destigmatising it, and it's obviously has its benefits that can be, the MD can understand, and if we can get that out there, and I'm sure Catherine will take a note of the benefits that you've put forward there. And
Okay, thank you. Further to that, Convener, on page 109 of the report, it's the first question would be on the review of broad and general education, and it's just to ask what is the premise for that review and what do we hope to achieve?
Thank you, Councillor Dugan, for that question. So in terms of what we're looking to achieve, over the last number of years, we've seen significant change with the senior phase. And in fact, lastly, over the last 2 years, we're seeing the removal of internal units. So I think there's been a strong focus within our schools on the senior phase. And I think we now need to go back and revisit the broad general education to look at the transition from primary into secondary, but also look at the strength of the curriculum and look at how we can create a really progressive curriculum that ensures personalisation and choice, but also prepares our young people for moving on into the senior phase in a more, I suppose, a better way, a better transition between it. But I think it's time to revisit because many of the courses will have been set up and structured, and I say much of the teaching staff will have been focused on changes in the senior phase. So we're looking to come back and take more time to reflect and look at that area of the curriculum in a little more depth.
Okay, thank you for that. And just below that, Convener, extend the reach of instrumental music tuition. The middle point there is to further partnership, working to reduce financial barriers for families on lower incomes. So the financial barriers are patently a really significant thing, but I wonder if we could be reassured that officers and schools individually are looking sort of maybe more holistically about that insofar as any cursory glance of the schools who are engaged with the instrumental music service will identify an extremely well-defined SIMD split of the schools that access that opportunity and the schools that don't. And for the schools that don't, many of which are in my ward, I'm concerned that it's not just the financial barriers to it, it's the fact that it's not really an apparent reality of how people pursue things. So it's appropriate that we should have financial assistance, but we also have to actually work proactively about setting out this as an opportunity for people to pursue. Because if you see lots of people in your school engaged in music tuition, then that's a reality for you. If there's nobody in your school engaged in music tuition, the financial barriers are neither here nor there because it's just not something that you do. So we need to work at that. How do we do that?
Thank you, Councillor Dugan, and that is something that we've been working through recently about in terms of the charging policy. We're looking to significantly broaden the number of free places available and looking to base that upon free school meal entitlement, which beforehand was an additional bursary that was being considered, but now we're looking to broaden that completely to ensure that those young people will have access who are entitled to that free school meal entitlement. So that's the first thing. We're looking at levels of debt. So that should not be a barrier for those young people coming on to free places within the music service. So that's another thing we're taking forward at this time about working with our colleagues in corporate finance to look at a request to make amendments to the financial regulations. So that's gone in as a formal request. And also working with the Music Foundation and the other parental bodies. And in fact, I'm meeting with those groups next week to look at how we broaden the reach, as well as looking at the take-up across all our schools and working with the instrumental music instructors group to make sure that we are hitting all of the areas that we should do, and it's not just some schools. We're making sure that every school has access to a similar level of entitlement.
Thank you. If that's the end of the questions, do we have any comments? The only comment I will say, I'm glad to see that Bertha Park is moving forward apace, and that the ward of Strathay will finally have a secondary school in it, and I'm sure it'll be the best school in Perth and Kinross because it's in ward. And also thank for the what somebody termed when they showed me it was an idiot's guide to what you do, and it was then quickly identified as a counsellor's guide. So thanks for that.
So not much of a distinction there.
Hope you find it helpful.
Much. So we now go on to the Corporate and Democratic Services BMIT, and this is the first time that this report sees the light of day. It's the committee that comes to, and the only committee it comes to. So I'll ask Lisa if she can introduce this, please.
Comes here because you're our special committee. So you'll know that last year in September, Corporate and Democratic Services produced their first independent 3-year plan, because previously our actions were incorporated under the business plan and the corporate plan for the council. That was a fairly detailed plan with a lot of information about what we did, who we were, what our priorities were. What we have here is the update for 2019, a bit more streamlined, but also focusing, again, telling you what we do. And you'll be able to see from page 3 of Appendix 2 the broad range of functions that are included within corporate and democratic services. We've also tried to summarise what we do in terms of the internal functions that we do to support the council and other services to deliver on the council's strategic objectives, but also the frontline services that we deliver directly, which allows us to connect our communities face to face in the form of licensing, welfare rights, benefits advice, that type of thing. We've given some highlights of the things that our performance this year in terms of what we've done internally to support good governance and what we've done directly to support the frontline services that we provide to our communities. I have a number of my SMT colleagues here alongside, and we're more than happy to try and answer as many questions as you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll start with Councillor Donaldson because I know he's to leave early, so I'll let him get his question in first.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Aim at low risk, page 127, point 1.3, and it's to ask Karen Donaldson. We have the annual workforce report in December, but there's also the equal pay audit that's going to be carried out this summer. Can I ask, one, is that audit carried out on an annual basis? And secondly, even though it's categorised as low risk, can we be absolutely confident that in terms of not just pay, but in terms of total compensation packages for our employees, that we have removed all unequal, unjust provisions?
Thank you for that question. We have been carrying out an equal pay audit on an annual basis, and that is published information. It doesn't come to committee, it normally goes to the Member Officer Working Group for Equalities, and then it's information that goes into the public domain thereafter. And the plan this year is to incorporate more of the detail from the employment equalities monitoring within the workforce report that will come to the council meeting in December. So elected members in that forum, in other words, all elected members will see more detailed information in terms of the employment equalities monitoring. In terms of the outcomes from our equal pay audit, there have been no significant risks identified in terms of equal pay, looking at total remuneration and basic pay. Our plans this year are to do more of a deep dive into different aspects of our overall remuneration package. So we're becoming more sophisticated every year that we look at it, because we've not identified any major risks in terms of that overall data. And now we're starting to use our time and our energies to look into particular areas. And for example, across our workforce, we know that we do have some occupational segregation, which is there are some occupations where there are higher groups of one gender as opposed to another. And part of this is societal issues, and we want to actually understand some of that more and look at doing some more bespoke work in order to tackle things such as that. But there are no risks in terms of equal pay that would end up with the Council in tribunal. We have no outstanding equal pay claims, and we have had a recent internal audit of our job evaluation practices. Job evaluation is the method by which we determine the grade for jobs, and that had a clean bill of health. So I can give the committee assurance that we are in a very good place in terms of equal pay. And now we're actually looking on some of the kind of more systemic issues in terms of how we promote equalities across our workforce.
Could I just follow up by saying, one, I find that reassuring, and also in particular the fact that you're not resting on your laurels. You still want to look at this aspect, that aspect, and test things out. And what clearly I think is of greatest concern is in particular what's happening in Glasgow City Council and the problems the administration is facing there because of, I was going to say, the actions, but rather the lack of action on the part of its predecessors. But with ourselves, are you confident with connected organisations, joint ventures, and with ALIOs, similar considerations apply? Or the equal pay audit is purely for council employees? No?
The equal pay audit that we carry out is purely for council employees. So individual employers are responsible for their employment obligations in terms of equal pay. And in terms of, we're very alert to what's happening across the rest of Scotland in terms of equal pay claims. That risk has been removed from Perth and Kinross Council's risk register because of the actions that we took around the implementation of the single status pay and grading structure and settling equal pay claims, so there is no residual risk in relation to the similar claims that other councils are actually facing. And our current arrangements in terms of our approach to determining salaries is robust, and therefore that's why low risk has been applied to that rating.
So it doesn't even feature in the corporate risk register?
It no longer features in the corporate risk register because that risk has been removed. It was there for a number of years prior to implementation of single status, and as we settled the equal pay claims that Perth and Kinross Council faced, we have zero now. And Audit Scotland also have taken an interest in this matter across Scottish local authorities, and basically we have nothing to report because this issue has gone for us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Purvis.
Thank you. I've got two questions, if that is all right. The first one is on the various issues highlighted at 2.2, 2.3 and 2.4 in the Appendix 1, which is the action plan. I think that's page 127, 128. And specifically in relation to the issues raised about the work on the Perth and Kinross offer or deal, and also it talks about finding better ways to work with communities and local action partnerships. So first, I have raised before that obviously some of us have different views about the success or otherwise of local action partnerships, but I also think it's very important to include community councils within that, and I know that that might be suggested that comes under communities, but as much as local action partnerships, although there are different models, are explicitly underpinned by the Community Empowerment Act, community councils are also statutory bodies underpinned by legislation as well. So I think that we should always, if we're going to include local action partnerships explicitly, should also include community councils. But more specifically, my question is around 2.4, where it talks about supporting local action partnerships to meet the national target, I think that's been agreed between COSLA and the Scottish Government of 1% of the council spend to be determined through community choices or participatory budgeting. I think in relation to the Perth and Kinross offer or deal, that perhaps there are further discussions to be had about how that's going to work, and I think much of that might be achieved by what we end up doing with the Perth and Kinross offer. But I think that clearly there it's talking about supporting local action partnerships to do it. I think that we shouldn't preempt that discussion Sorry? Yeah, we shouldn't preempt that discussion by saying it's going to be local action partnerships. So I just want clarity that the community choices participatory budgeting target of 1% doesn't have to be delivered through local action partnerships. And indeed, I think that the direction of travel that we're going, we might even be able to exceed that in a few years' time.
Sorry, stretching there. So your question, Councillor Purvis, just to clarify, is whether local action partnerships have to be the mechanism for achieving the 1% target. The answer is that currently, yes, they probably do, and that is because the Council several years ago approved the setup of local action partnerships as the mechanism for local community planning. However, a lot has changed since then. You're absolutely right. The development of the Perth and Kinross offer, which is fundamentally about the new relationship between the Council and its communities, may mean that mechanisms look different in the future. That will be a matter for Council to determine on the basis of policy advice from officers.
Thank you. I think that's the point. Obviously, at the minute, that's what we've set up and that's the model, but it was just to clarify that there is nothing preventing us, should we choose, from changing that. It doesn't have to be delivered through a local action partnership type model.
That would be, the head of legal may want to add to this, that would be a significant matter of policy for full council, Councillor Purvis. So yes, it can be changed on consideration of the options, as we would normally do, prepared by officers for council.
I think for fear of straying into comment, well, I think I've already strayed into comment, so it's a bit late now, but I think it's important for us to look at all of those options. We have talked about working with communities to support them to deliver services or deliver services themselves in future, and that might require different governance arrangements to those that we are traditionally
I think it is an evolving picture on how we're going to deliver this, and we've just started on a journey, and as we move forward, lessons will be learned about ways of delivering it, and I think everybody would agree with that.
Okay, my second question, which I will try to keep brief. I was quite...
Councillor Donaldson's had enough. And, he did hear that Councillor Stewart was up next, so...
This one's for Mrs Simpson. I was quite excited to read at 5.1 about the forthcoming plans to revise the standing orders and the Council's decision-making structures. I was just wondering whether you could give some more information on, do we have any understanding of how we think that might look already, what we're trying to achieve by the review, and whether there will be full engagement of elected members in that process before it comes to full council, I presume, at some point.
I will make no comment on the fact that you got excited about the contents of 5.1. In terms of the governance review, the reason why the governance structure needs to be reviewed is obviously as we're about to embark on the development of the Perth and Kinross offer, that is going to involve a different way of working, a different way of engagement, a different way of decision making. So we need to make sure that our governance structure is aligned to deliver the way that we want to operate going forward. So clearly there is an opportunity. It's not just about housekeeping, it's about looking whole scale at how do we actually have to do decision making, how do we actually have to support the governance structure to make sure that we're making the best use of the resources that we have. And also streamlining some things so that we're not making things difficult for ourselves, so that we're making things quite clear, so that we can be transparent, so we can be accountable. So that will be a significant piece of work that will evolve. I don't have any preconceived ideas as to what that looks like, because I think we really need to see how the Perth and Kinross offer shapes up. And it will be evolving. And even once we have reviewed that, I don't think it'll be set in stone, because I think once we then embed and embark on a new way of working, we'll be constantly reviewing and refining to make sure that our governance and decision making and infrastructure supports what we want to achieve in the delivery of the outcomes. There is obviously a clear need for elected members to be involved. If we're going to be fundamentally looking at how we make decisions as an organisation, then you will be integral to the development of these discussions and the shaping of what that may look like. It will be a significant piece of work, however.
Thanks. Councillor Parrott.
Thank you very much. I think my question follows on from Councillor Purvis, and it relates specifically to 2.4. and the business of the 1%. As presented to us on its initial outing, I would hope that the Perth and Kinross offer goes well beyond 1% of our spend, if it is to mean actually the sort of transformation that we're talking about. But equally, I'm concerned that 1% of our spend determined through community choices participatory budgeting would amount to about, I think, £4 million or £800,000, the 5 original action partnerships. And I suppose my specific question to Fiona, if I may, is what is the nature of the low risk there? Is it a low risk that we'll actually spend that 1%? Or just what is the nature of that risk? Because I think from my perception of the action partnerships at the moment, there'll have to be a step change in activity levels and engagement before realistically that sort of sum of money can be properly channeled through the action partnerships by that timeline of March 2020. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Power. I think there are probably, you can sum up the nature of the risk in 3 ways. I think the first you've touched on already, which is about understanding genuine capacity and appetite of communities to take on what might be some quite significant fiscal decisions. To be clear, I'm not saying that communities are not capable of doing that, but I am saying there are significant responsibilities inherent in that. So we have to be upfront and honest about the level of appetite as well as capacity. The second element, which I think is probably currently the biggest, is the uncertainty around the national landscape. So the second phase of the National Local Governance Review launched a week or so ago. There are still a lot of questions, I think, in the minds of national policymakers and ministers who have indicated, I believe, they want to take time to get any further legislation around local governance right. That doesn't mean that we should necessarily hold back from putting arrangements in place which are right for Perth and Kinross, and the Perth and Kinross offer again will be fundamental to that, but there will be further legislative changes and policy changes at a national level that we need to take cognizance of, but we're still not yet clear exactly what those are. And the third element, I think, is around understanding what mechanisms for devolved decision-making, particularly fiscal decision-making, work best. There is an assumption, which is a reasonable assumption as part of the 1% target, that participatory budgeting is the right way to take decisions about how money is spent locally. However, it's not the only way. And I think we would be keen, and in fact the CADS management team are looking at a paper on this tomorrow when it meets tomorrow. We would be keen to explore other methods of engaging communities in taking decisions, particularly when you get into the territory of decision making around statutory services, lifeline services, where clearly communities need to be as informed as possible about the implications of those decisions.
Thanks. Do you have a question, Councillor McCune? Yeah.
It's referring to item 3.2 on the digital transfer to the MyPKC portal. You know, I have anecdotal evidence from constituents, but we go on facts here, not anecdotal evidence. So where people have tried to report things like potholes, and because they have to log in through the MyPKC, and for them it's not worked, whether it's a connection issue, whether it's them forgetting passwords and usernames and all these sort of things. So the question I have is, do we actually record when people are trying to get into MyPKC and have failed? So therefore, because obviously then we're creating a barrier for people reporting things into our services.
I can honestly say, Councillor McCune, I don't know that, but I'll find that out. Bring it back.
Okay, Councillor Dugan.
Thank you. I've got a supplementary to Councillor McEwan's, which I'll get to in a wee second, if that's all right, Convener. But I just have some very quick questions. The first was on Appendix 1, and it's just to confirm that there was substantial, from the last administration, substantial investment amounting to £5 million, I think, for the PH2O project. That's clearly been subject to a change in political will over the last couple of years. That being the case, it nevertheless has introduced delay to a significant capital investment project of a couple of years. Could I ask for advice on how much that will have, if the cost 2 years ago was circa 20 million, what will it cost 2 years or 3 years later to deliver a similar project? Because it won't be 20 million.
Yeah, I think we could ask Mr. Mackenzie what construction inflation is running at, the rates of construction inflation compounded up over, say, 4 years. Or maybe Fiona knows.
I can answer the question, I think, broadly, and I'll follow up and clarify with Stephen Crawford as Head of Property. So construction inflation is volatile, Councillor Duggan, as I'm sure you know. I believe it generally goes between 4 and 6% annually. I will double check that with Mr. Crawford and get back to you. I'm pretty sure, though, if he were here, he would say it's quite difficult to compound that up and project accurately for you in terms of how that might look in 2 years' time. What I can say is that since the council decision in February to allocate £500,000 towards developing an outline design scheme and a really crisp business case for PH2O, that work is proceeding at pace. Hubco are involved and we're procuring key elements of the work. Through Hubco, we have a senior officer group which I chair, which is meeting on a 3-weekly basis, and we have an elected members update and briefing scheduled for early September.
Thank you very much. In response to that reply, Convener, I accept that it's difficult to accurately pinpoint an exact figure, but on the basis that construction inflation is a real thing, with every year's delay you will get less for your money, or what you were trying to build will become more expensive.
Yes, it definitely is a major cost to projects. I was speaking yesterday to Brian Reid about construction inflation as regards Gowrie Recreation Centre, and it's expected to rise by more than 3% the next 2 years, and then up to 7%. So if you're looking at a 4-year project, you could compound up 20% in building construction costs.
Okay.
But we'll wait till Fiona will come back with more direct figures. But obviously, every year you kick a project back, you either get less for your money or it costs you more.
Additionally, just further down on item 5.6, review of budget setting process to align with the achievements of the Council's strategic priorities. And that's got a target date of October 20. Are we sure that that's not October 19?
Thank you, Councillor Duggan. I'll reflect on that target date. Clearly, we'd want to implement before that date if we're going to have any impact on the forthcoming budget process. So I'll check the date.
Yeah. I think that's just an error. Yeah, I think there would be some surprise amongst the political groups if it wasn't this year. And then I think on page 138, Convener, we get to what we did well together for our communities in 2018. I think there are some genuine, absolute nuggets of really good achievement in there. Unfortunately, they're interspersed with really just what you do for the day job as well. And I think it would have much more impact going forward if we filtered some of the ordinary stuff out and left it with exceptional stuff, such as increasing the cohort of foster carers and innovative. So, and they kind of merge together as well. The bullets have gone all over the place. But increasing the cohort of foster carers is a tremendous achievement. Generating an additional £6 million for customers from the Welfare Rights Team is a truly exceptional achievement. And these things are rightly highlighted in there. It was just really a suggestion for the report going forward.
Yes, you can. Thanks for
I take that on board, and it's maybe not the most delicious read, but this is a performance report for a back office, effectively, service whose stuff is unseen, and whilst it might be boring and tedious, it's absolutely essential. And
Convener, I never said boring and tedious. I said that the really exceptional high-level achievements are drowned out by otherwise ordinary things, like we processed 1,758 requests from people. Okay, well done. You know, that's neither here nor there. Increasing the cohort of foster carers and delivering an extra £6 million through the Welfare Rights Team is exceptional. It's profound.
I think this probably highlights one of the difficulties that we'll have when corporate and democratic services have to put up a performance report.
And all performance reports, if you put it in, it's redundant. If you leave it out, it was essential. You can't win.
Thanks.
Quick comment. If it wasn't for all the people in the back office doing all the, whatever we describe as dull and tedious jobs, we would know about it. The fact that they do it quietly and get on with it and achieve success doesn't mean that we shouldn't be proud of these quiet and tedious achievements, because if they weren't done, then all hell would break loose.
I don't think anybody called them dull and tedious. I think Lisa. Doing well. Lisa was making. They're maybe not so headline catching. I think that's what the thing was in. Yeah.
Convener, sorry, I did mention that I had a supplementary to one of Councillor McEwen's questions, and he's just reminded me that was to, I think my PKC. I think it's really brilliant. And with all of these platforms, when they're new, they're available for continuous improvement. I think many of us will remember the UK's government gateway when it opened first. It's a vastly improved service now than it was 10 years ago. However, I think I counted when I went to replace my brown bin permit, I think I had to transact 12 pages on the website to do that. So I wonder if officers could reassure us that having set up a really important way of doing business going forward, well, not going forward now and going forward, we've got a review, maybe not a big all singing, all dancing review, but somebody somewhere is looking for areas to improve that and make it more slick, because there is room for improvement.
I would expect there'd be a continuous review as that moves
I'll
forward.
specifically feed that back.
Thanks. We have still got quite a lot of stuff on the agenda here. Is everybody happy for... You got a question, Councillor Stewart?
You said that Councillor Donaldson leaving because he knew that I was next.
I was half in jest.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I took you I'm afraid I took you seriously. Can I just go back to the first part of Councillor Purvis's question about the action partnerships and the community councils? And can I suggest that there was an unanswered question, which was, if community councils are, as they are, statutory bodies, then it is worth pulling out our commitment to them in terms of engaging with communities, staff. If we're specifically going to mention local action partnerships, which are not statutory bodies, we do have to have community planning partnerships, but we do not have to have them set up as local action partnerships in the way that we do, but we do have to have community councils set up in the way that we do. That it would be useful if officers would take that away and incorporate that comment. And the other point that I was going to ask is, I think I've asked it on a couple of occasions before, and I don't know if I've yet got an answer. When we look at Appendix 2.4 and the requirement supporting action partnerships or whoever to meet the national target of 1% of council spend, and I think it would be more appropriate to reflect, it would be appropriate to reflect in this context that council spend, it's a 1% of council spend, but the action partnerships do bring together our other public planning partners. How much, in terms of status and in terms of achieving that by March 2020, how much is actually spent at the moment through community choices, participatory budgeting, various other mechanisms such as the Community Investment Fund or the Community Environment Challenge Fund. Do we have a running total of what percentage we're at in order to know how far we've got to go towards that 1% total by March 2020?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Stewart. Apologies for the unanswered question from Councillor Purvis. I thought it was a comment, and very happy, of course, to make sure that community councils are specifically referenced given their status as statutory consultees of the council. So we will amend that in the BMEP. On your question, I don't have the answer off the top of my head, I'm afraid, Councillor Stewart. I'll happily go and check it for you. It's a good question. A couple of things on that. One is, it is, as you know from previous discussion this afternoon, what we already determined through participatory budgeting is nowhere near the 1% target, which is round about 4.5 million of the council's total spend. Number two, community choices, participatory budgeting, in other words, is no longer available for local authorities to bid to, only community groups. So, for example, Lethem for All applied directly to the fund and got money, which they are distributing through PB, but the council's not directly involved in that. So I'll aim to give you a reasonable approximation, but it will be an approximation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the other point I was just going to make was that there's reference to actions in the Community Learning and Development Plan, and I went to look for it on the council website, typed in Community Learning and Development Plan. Best approximation I can find is search number 2, which takes me to the Community Learning and Development page. And on the right-hand side, sure enough, there is a plan, but it's the 2015 to 2018 plan, and I'm going to presume that we've got a more up-to-date one. It would be useful, I think, if that was easily found on the website and circulated to members so that we could have a look at it. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. And somebody will take that back.
Just to clarify, the Community Learning and Development Plan was approved at Council in February, so it's available on the committee papers, Councillor Stewart. It's not yet been published online because we're still finalising its translation into Gaelic. So it will be online shortly.
Thank you very much. I think we sort of incorporated a lot of comments in the question, so if there are no further comments, we can agree the paper, note the paper, wherever it is, note the paper. So we'll now go on to the annual governance statement. Again, it's Lisa Simpson will introduce this report.
Thank you, Convener. An annual governance statement is required to be attached to the final accounts, but we bring it here to scrutiny because what it is a general overall assessment, particularly in terms of risk and controls. The process for assurance around the annual governance statement is in different layers. Each service looks at the controls within their area across the functions that they deliver, and do quite a detailed self-assessment of that. Key officers who carry out the governance functions, so that's most of the corporate officers and CADs, and other parts of the organisation do their own self-assessment around particular controls in these areas and provide assurance. And then all of the evidence that is gathered through self-assessment is then looked at critically by the Policy and Governance Group before assurance is then sought from the directors and sign-off from the corporate control from the officers involved. You will see that the control system, the system of internal control in our governance framework is robust, fit for purpose. That is our assessment. There are a few areas, obviously, where we would like to improve, but the good thing and the assuring thing is that there is nothing there that came out of the annual governance assurance process that was a shock to us in any way. All of the activities or all of the issues or areas that have been highlighted are either ongoing improvement actions or already identified as planned and scheduled work. So all in all, a good report, a robust framework, but happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions on this report? Councillor Illingworth.
It's not a criticism as such. I compared this annual government statement to last year's annual government statement, and it seems to be roughly the same. That's not criticism, it just means it worked to me it just worked last year, and there's no reason why it shouldn't work this year. My question is, how do we ensure that the principles are the foundation of everybody's behaviour within the organisation?
The reason that a lot of the annual governance statement is in a similar form is because a lot of the requirements are statutory. So there is a lot of things that we have to explain and outline. We choose to do it in an awful lot of detail, because when people then ask, what do you mean by the governance framework, we can actually point them to an annual governance statement and say, this is a pretty robust description of what our framework is. In terms of testing the assurance, the way the self-assessment exercise is carried out is not about tick a box that you've got a policy, tick a box that you've got a process, because we do have a robust suite of processes. And the questions that are asked are you satisfied that the people within your service are following those policies? Are you satisfied that these processes are fit for purpose for you? Is there any areas where you need to change that? There's a number of the corporate officers here who obviously completed some of the control questionnaires, so I'm sure they would be able to back up that that's the approach that is looked at. And when the self-assessment evidence is produced by services such as H&E or ECS, the policy and governance group will look at that, and they'll ask the typical 3-year-old question, but how? But why? So that is the process. That is the process that's followed. So it's not just about, have you got the infrastructure in place? It's, do you know that that infrastructure is working for you? Is it supporting you to deliver the best outcomes that you can? Is it supporting the organisation to be the best organisation that it can be?
Great, thank you.
Can I ask about the ALIOs? We do have, so in 2.4 on the first page, it talks about that the statement covers them, and then I think it is covered in 5.6, although we do have annual governance statements from Tayside Contracts and the Valuation Joint Board and the Integration Joint Board. I'm just wondering that although there's a number of things listed there, I think I asked last year that whether they had their own annual governance statements. So they don't, no. Should they?
They go through the same. I think the reason why we rely on the, and Stuart, you can maybe help me here, because it's about how they're categorised in the accounts. Tayside Contracts and Tayside Valuation Joint Board, are they classed as subsidiaries?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So they have to produce their own annual governance statement. The ALIOs themselves don't, but we put them through the same self-assessment. So they do the same evidence questionnaire, the self-evaluation questionnaire, and that gets scrutinised again by the Policy and Governance Group. And Fiona makes sure that that's submitted, and she then gives her assurance in terms of where she sees the controls from a contract monitoring perspective.
So just to pick up on that, would there be situations whereby you would say you don't have assurance that the adequate governance arrangements are in place? Because we had example last year, obviously it's on a slightly different scale, but with NHS Tayside at the Integration Joint Board, they weren't able to provide assurance to the IGB that the adequate governance arrangements had been in place for, I think, for 17-18. But because they don't have their own annual governance statement, and this thing is done.
The IGB do.
Oh, sorry, I'm meaning the ALIOs now.
Right, okay.
And because the ALIOs, that was just an example, because the ALIOs don't, and we're just doing that ourselves, obviously we've raised concerns, particularly in relation to Horsecross, which we're about to deal with later on. Have there been instances in the past where we've said we haven't, although we don't have an explicit annual governance statement, which essentially will conclude whether or not the governance arrangements were adequate or not, would we, as part of our internal process, looking at them, classing them as a subsidiary, say that the governance arrangements weren't adequate for the ALIOs, but they might be for other parts of the council overall?
I actually think it works in the opposite way. I think we actually get more assurance by the fact that we carry out the self-assessment. So we basically put the ALIOs through an annual governance statement assurance evaluation. And so we gather that evidence and we look at that evidence and we challenge that evidence. Fiona, I don't know if you want to explain how it works in practice.
Well, just as you've outlined it, but on your question about whether there's ever been a situation in the past where we've not been able to offer assurance as chief officers that ALIOs have got the right governance in place, no, there hasn't, Councillor Purvis. However, it's certainly true to say that in 2012, when the council took the decision to move the status of the ALIOs to sole member company status, that was very much taking cognizance of the fact that some completely independent ALIOs, and ours were completely independent of the council prior to 2012, there were issues around governance and transparency, which Audit Scotland was raising in general terms, and that was the reason why we took that step, because as sole member companies, Horse Culture, Perth and Kinross and Live Active Leisure are bound to come to scrutiny. You're seeing Horsecross later this afternoon, and we can put them through that AGS process, which Donald and I do as a sort of double act in terms of support and challenge to the ALIOs about where they need to be better. The key area, I think, over the last, Horsecross is a slightly different situation, so leaving that to the side. The key area is really around transparency of reporting to taxpayers and the public what the ALIOs are delivering, and that's they've made some quite big strides in that direction over the last few years, but there is still more to do.
Councillor Parrott.
Thank you very much. I've got a question relating to the list of areas where there are appropriate internal controls at the bottom of page 153 of 202. Are those specific areas that relate to reports, or are they general areas that are subject to controls? And I ask that in the context of, we go on in this meeting next to look at, data protection, compliance and cyber security, and I wonder whether they are included within line items there, or whether they're not. And I suppose my question is, does that list of areas refer to specific reports that are created, or is it just general areas of internal control?
These have been identified as the key general areas for internal control. So there are the, some of them are required in terms of the SIPFA governance framework. So there will be particular things that the governance framework that the AGS is modelled around has to have assurance around specific controls. So there are all the key controls that they have to, and information management and information security is looking at two different things. Information security, as well as looking at data protection and that type of aspect, is also looking at the technical controls that are in place around the systems. And information governance is really about the access and the management and the retention around how we hold data and how we use data. But they're probably, they're a key list of the internal control areas that we need to provide assurance around. There's not specific reports. The data protection report that's coming up is a statutory report that is required by the data protection officer under the new legislation.
Thank you.
If we have no further questions, any comments? Can we note the report? Thanks. I'm going to hand over to the Vice Convener for the next 4 papers.
Thank you very much, Convener. Moving swiftly on then, we come to paper 9, which is the Data Protection Compliance 2018-2019. Can I ask Donald Henderson to introduce this report? Thank you.
Thank you. This is the first such report, so I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about it. It was interesting writing it. I'd never had to set myself to put it all down like this before. In summary, the council is doing okay. I could stop now. I don't think an organisation as big and as complex as the council will ever be able to say it is fully compliant all the time. And I would challenge each of you to say you were fully compliant with the highway code all the time, in the same sort of way. You always get things wrong. We've got lots of people, we do lots of things with personal data, we will get it wrong occasionally. In general, we have the council has the right pillars in place, and we are doing the right things. And I open it for your questions.
Thank you, Roch. Convener, first question.
Thanks, Donald. And I know this is out with your control, but I think on reading the pre-agenda and then the paper, the most concerning thing for me is that is the training and uptake of the modules. I think if you don't do the data breach module, you probably could be breaching the data regulations without knowing it to a certain extent. And if only 9% of the possible staff have undertaken this training, it would mean to me that there would be a lot of possibly breaches going unnoticed. And I think that as convener of the Scrutiny Committee, I would like Lisa possibly to inform the executives of the services that they make a concerted effort to try and encourage their staff to take up this training, and that would maybe close a little bit of the mesh of the net. Would you agree that that would be a useful move by the Scrutiny Committee?
Yes, I will actually be speaking to the Executive Officer team about this next week. The timing didn't work. I should have been there before we came here, but it'll be after. It has been highlighted in an internal audit report. I'm highlighting it. I'd like to think between internal audit and myself, we should actually be able to make some progress across the council.
Thanks, and Lisa would like to comment on that too.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points that I would like to make. I know that he forgot he wasn't the convener. There's 2 points that I'd like to make. The 9% uptake of the general module is very disappointing, and I can give assurances to Scrutiny that I have already raised this with the Executive Officer team, and the Executive Officer team have undertaken to make sure that the message is given out that there needs to be a bigger uptake of the training. I would like to provide some assurance, however, that in the high-risk areas, bespoke training was delivered either in face-to-face sessions, presentations, one-to-one discussions in the high areas where we were managing the key areas that process sensitive personal information. And I don't know whether Mr. Henderson would like to provide some more assurance around that, the training that was given in there, which wasn't really the generic module.
Yeah, we've spent quite a lot of time going and visiting particular teams, giving some general training to them, and then we tend to spend twice as long answering their questions as they raise particular issues that they have, so that we are tailoring what we're saying exactly to what they need. A lot of work has been done with children's services, some work done with adult services, which are the key areas as far as personal data is concerned.
Thank you. Councillor Hearn.
Thanks very much. I welcome this report, having worked in data protection in my previous job. In terms of the training, we made it a mandatory module, and it has to be redone every year so that you keep up with it. In terms of elected members, we are our own data controllers under GDPR, and I just wondered if it was a council were responsible for taking figures regarding the... You're shaking your head, so I'll take that as the answer.
Thank you, Roch. Councillor Coates.
In terms of data protection, one of the things is that you should shred anything with anybody's personal data or bank details or anything else. Every office, every councillor's office is not equipped with shredders. Can this be attended to?
I think there is a central shredder available to all of us that's just where we sign in. So I think that's...
There's no longer a shredder, it's a collection box. It's
Yeah.
done by secure collection, and that's outside the office.
In fairness, I think that requirement is adequately covered. You just have to... Are there any other questions, Councillor McKeown?
I've got the question that's come up. Is this training part of a new member of staff's induction package as well? Because I know within the NHS side we have an induction package and there's general training, core training as part of that.
Sorry, I'm having to ask Donald here with his other hat on. There have been discussions with the OD team, hasn't there, about how we can incorporate data protection into the induction, and there is the standalone module that we're encouraging staff to complete. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay.
Now my real question that I've been thinking about for a bit longer. On page, what page is that? Page 161, so it's item 324 and 325. So we're getting the breakdown of data into services and then a breakdown into the nature of the breaches. Within the table in the red, the data breaches by service, the adult care services seems quite a high level of data breach, considering the size of the service when you compare that to education and children's services and the housing environment. And for each of these actual services, are the services getting the breakdown of where the data breaches are as well, so that they can then reflect on their practice and then obviously try and cut out the data breaches?
The services are well aware of what breaches they have caused and have taken appropriate actions.
The other part I had in that is why is adult care services looks proportionally higher considering the size of the services.
Can you comment on that? No. I think for my part, my understanding of the nature of this is that breaches have to be reported, they're not discovered. So if you like, the breaches are what come out of understanding training, understanding what is a breach, and that reflects the numbers to a degree. And there may well be breaches that are not listed because they're not discovered or known about. Anyway, any more questions? Yes, Councillor Stewart.
It's a very quick question, just to clarify my understanding. In the covering report at 2.6, the organisation, the council, doesn't have a programme of mandatory training per se. Does this mean not mandatory for data protection, data breaches, or not mandatory at all? What's the meaning of that sentence? There must be surely a programme of mandatory training in some basic, apart from anything else, health and safety elements.
Sorry, I'm be honest that that was the advice that we were given by the OD department, because we did have discussions about making certain training modules mandatory. There are certain roles where there will have to be mandatory training before they could take up the post or fulfil that. So, but in terms of the generic training, the discussion was, can we make certain things? And they said at the moment, our OD, there isn't mandatory training as such. But I think that's part of the discussion that we want to have with EOT, in terms of there are certain ones where we think the data protection one should be.
Okay, just because I know Councillor McKeown works for the NHS. I sit on the staff governance committee at the NHS. There's a set of mandatory training requirements for all staff there, regardless of what role you're doing. Even when we came in as councillors, one of the mandatory things that we were issued was our display screen equipment. That was mandatory for all of us. When I worked in the private sector, there was mandatory training, regardless of which role and at which level you performed it in the organisation. I would think that there would be a base core of mandatory
Well, I
training.
think that would be wrapped up in the induction.
Okay. It's just,
and it's probably just the use of the language, mandatory.
Thank you.
But I think the core things would be wrapped up in the induction.
I think I'm very familiar, as one or two others are, with mandatory training, and I would welcome the council's, if you like, EOT team looking in more depth at what can or might be made mandatory in certain areas. Thank you. Any more questions on this paper? Any comments on this paper? Can we note this paper? Thank you very much. Moving on to paper 10, the annual review of cyber security. Can I please ask Lisa to introduce this paper? Thank you.
With your permission, actually, I think I'll hand this over to our Information Compliance Officer, Mr. Henderson.
Donald.
Thank you. This report has previously gone each year for the last couple of years to Strategic Policy and Resources Committee, but it was felt that actually it sits better coming here. It summarises where we are on cybersecurity and what cybersecurity is. It's never possible to say that the council is secure. What we are saying is that we have fairly adequate measures in place to ensure our security. We are compliant with the Public Services Network Code of Connection, and towards the end of May we achieved the Cyber Essentials Plus accreditation as well. The report outlines a couple of areas where we're wanting to do more work. The big area for us over the coming year is the cloud and Office 365 in particular, as the council moves to adopt that, because it requires a very different approach to security. No longer is it a case of just locking your front door and making sure your windows are shut, because actually you're living in the community now, and you're sort of spread out across the community. I'm happy to take questions to the best of my ability.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Councillor McKeown.
Is there any evidence that having a Hawaii phone is a security risk?
As far as I'm aware, no.
And Councillor Hearn.
Thank you very much, Vice Convener. As you and I are both aware, paragraph 5 on page 178 dealing with the UK Government Armed Forces classification, I just wondered, the last comment there is the council currently have no formal classification scheme. I just wondered if there's something that's been looked into.
Donald, can you make comment on that?
Yes, it is. We are looking again to try and implement the government scheme, which doesn't work very well. The problem is it doesn't work very well for local authorities, but it is slowly being not exactly forced on us, but most of our national partners like Police Scotland, the NHS, are using the government approach, so we're kind of having to move down that way, although we have resisted doing it because it didn't seem to be as beneficial as it might have been. But we are looking at it again this year.
Any more questions? Any comments? I'd just make one myself, if I may, here, and that's in answer to Councillor McKeown. I think that the problem with the Huawei phones is that you wouldn't know whether it was being looked at. That's the whole point about them. But in asking if we can note this report. I think that Mr. Henderson takes a very pragmatic view, both with data protection and with the cyber security, in a sense accepting that we will not everywhere comply all the time. And I'm, you know, to me, that's a sign of a pragmatic, a sensible approach. If we had officers coming to us saying that we are covered everywhere all the time, both with relation to data protection and cyber security, I would have concerns about such a statement straight away. Can we note paper 10? Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Moving on swiftly to paper 11, the FOI performance report. Can I ask Lisa Simpson to introduce this report?
This is the annual performance report that we're required to produce for the Scrutiny Committee. You will see the key point is it's a good news report. There have been an increasing number of requests, but we've managed to maintain the target of 95% in terms of meeting the target levels for managing these within the appropriate timescale, etc. I think the one rider that I would put on that is that if, with the existing resources that we have, if numbers continue to increase as they have done year on year over the last few years, I think maintaining the 95% target may become more and more of a challenge. But we're happy to take any questions on that. And Mr. Henderson also manages the FOI team, so he's here too.
Questions, Councillor McKeown?
When there's commonality in the type of requests we're getting, are we therefore reflecting on making that type of information more readily available so that freedom of information requests are no longer necessary?
Yeah, we look at the type of requests that we're getting, and if we see sort of themes emerging or people asking for the same type of questions, then obviously we're working with services to try and make more and more information publicly available. So where we can publish something that might then allow us to simply direct people who are making requests to either a website or a portal or something, we are doing that. And we constantly monitor that, we constantly review that.
Any more questions? I've got one myself then, if I may. My understanding of the Act is that sheer capacity is not a... you're not allowed under the Act to quote capacity as a reason for not answering an FOI question. But in that sense, I would hope and ask whether we are using the justification that you can on excessive cost whenever it's appropriate.
My understanding is yes, but it's quite difficult to actually use that as it really does have to be quite significant, but perhaps Mr. Henderson would like to come in on that.
We do use excessive cost, but it's the cost limit is set in legislation, but it's set in terms of a total cost against an hourly cost that was set many years ago. So it's an academic figure, but it amounts to about 40 hours work. And it's quite interesting. People will say to us, is this going to be excessive cost? And when you actually start to drill down, I'm not sure when anyone actually spent an entire week doing one thing without interruption, because that's basically what it is. It's spending an entire week doing only this one thing, answering this one FOI request. We do use it. It's very exceptional. Very small percentage of the requests that we get we're able to refuse because of excessive cost.
Yes, please come in.
Can I also add that there have been a number of requests that we've had recently where they could well have been justified as not being responded to on the basis of excessive cost, but we've taken a view that it was in the public interest to release the information. So despite the fact that it was way beyond the excessive cost parameters, the FOI requests were still adhered to.
Thank you, Lisa. Any more questions? Any comments? Can we note the paper? Thank you. Coming now on to paper 12, The registration of births, deaths, marriages and civil partnerships, inspection reports by National Records of Scotland. Again, Lisa, can I ask you to introduce this paper? Thank you.
This again is an annual report that is that's produced to Scrutiny Committee. One of the difficulties that we have here is that the delay in getting the information nationally has obviously made this report and the information in it of some vintage, but it is the latest statistics that we have in respect of these matters, and they're there for your information, and if we can answer any questions, we will.
Any questions? Councillor Illingworth.
Two questions. There's a number of localities where there are errors going on. It's not 100%. What is the definition of an error? And the second question, what is the potential impact of an error? Lisa.
An error, I think, could literally be anything. It could be an incorrect spelling of a name, etc. The other thing that I should have said actually at the beginning was it's really quite difficult because we do have rural offices and other areas that a single error where you have a small number of things being registered actually skews things. It's one of the difficulties of putting things in terms of percentage-wise. But an error is just basically anything that is inaccurate.
And what's the potential impact of an error?
I'm not aware of any errors that can't be fixed, if you see what I mean. You know, so I don't think there's anything there that would cause any great significance in terms of something that can't then retrospectively be fixed. But it was unfortunate that the registrar couldn't be with us today, but business is just chock-a-block across the way. But what she did say was that the Scrutiny Committee may not be aware of a lot of the things that the registrars do, so she would like the opportunity to perhaps come along and do maybe a 10-minute presentation and give the Scrutiny Committee a bit more insight into the types of work that they do, and then she would be able to pick up and address any issues like this in that presentation, if that would be something that the committee would like.
So for example, if somebody came along and said, I misregistered the sex of a baby, that could be fixed.
I think we would have to find a way to try and fix that. I don't know in detail, but what I'm saying, I can get that information back to you, or what we could do is have Hazel along for a wee bit of a presentation. I will put that challenge to her. What would you do if?
Thank you. Yes, I think that in the age we live in, that particular error might be a complex one, given all the conversation there is. Are there any other questions? Does anyone have any comment? I think in going through this paper, I worked out that our error rate across the local authority area was one error a fortnight, and against the numbers, and that's across all areas, so I think that's quite good. Can we note this paper? Thank you. Noted. Thank you. With the disappearance of the convener, I think we'll have a short intermission.
Could we have a comfort break?
Yes, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Vice Convener, I am going to leave the meeting now because I have to declare an interest in Horsecross Arts as a member of the board, so I shall leave now.
Thank you.
Welcome back, those who remain. We'll now have the update from Horsecross. We're going to start off, Fiona's going to give us an update from her perspective and officer's view, and then we'll have Peter Winkles will come across and answer some questions that we have, any questions we have on the recovery of Horsecross's position from the meeting that we had last time. So I'll hand over to Fiona.
Thanks, Convener. Is this working? Everybody hear me okay? Yep, great, okay. I think as the committee is aware, this is a slightly unusual situation as a result of decisions that were taken by SP&R committee back in April to intervene with the operations of Horsecross in order to bring about improvement. So I suppose from your perspective as committee members, there are really two things that you might want to scrutinise this afternoon. One is the council's legitimacy mandate, if you like, to intervene with Horsecross, because that is a very, very unusual step for a local authority to take. I can't think of a recent example in Scotland anyway over the last few years. So you need to be satisfied as a committee that the council is acting in the way that it should be to bring about improvement in Horsecross, which is what we all want to see. And just up there on the slide there, you can see the minute of the meeting from Strategic Policy and Resources Committee back in April, where the committee noted and approved that the Council Chief Executive has put recovery measures in place for Horsecross Arts by exercising our sole member company powers. The Council, as you know, is the sole member of Horsecross. It's also the sole member of Culture, Perth and Kinross and Live Active Leisure. What that means in practice is that where we have concerns about the running of any of those three organisations, we can take steps to intervene through our powers to direct. We can do that by directing the directors, in other words, the charitable trustees on the boards of these organisations, to take steps to bring about improvement. And we do that via a special clause in the Articles of Association that set, in this case, Horsecross Arts up. The council also has the power to appoint directors, charitable trustees to the board of Horsecross, and it has the power to remove directors if there are sufficient grounds for it to do so. So these are quite strong powers, and as I say, they're not ones that we use lightly. And our preference is always, when there is a concern about the performance of an ALIO, to work with the board of trustees to bring about improvement rather than to direct. So to bring that to life, as an example, because in terms of a real life example, because Horsecross is an independent charity, all three ALIOs are independent charities, whilst they are also sole member companies, and that can be quite a delicate line for both the ALIOs and the councils to walk. But what it means in practice is that through our contract with Horsecross Arts, we require them to deliver, for example, a programme of drama and a programme of classical music and a programme of dance and a programme of family and children's activities. And we can specify that in the contract, and that's perfectly legitimate. What we can't do is interfere with the independent decision-making of Horsecross in terms of how it delivers that day-to-day. So we can't say, for example, we would like you to only present Scottish drama or Shakespearean tragic drama or whatever. Those decisions, and I'm sure that might relieve some members of the committee, judge from Councillor Duggan's expression, because that is stepping into the day-to-day management decisions that Horsecross board is there to take. So we are in quite unusual territory. I've just got a couple of slides that I'm going to go through. You've asked questions in the past about the financial position of Horsecross, and you'll want to ask Mr. Winkles, who is the interim finance director of Horsecross at the moment, about some of these issues in more detail. What I've put there up on the slide is just some key points really for members to be aware of in terms of the position that Horsecross finds itself in at the moment. So we finished the financial year 2018-19 with a loss, which was around £162,000 once unrestricted reserves have been taken into account, but that means that Horsecross doesn't have reserves left, and you will be aware from our full council meeting in February that the council agreed to give additional financial support to Horsecross to assist it, given the position that it finds itself in. There are conditions attached to that financial support, and there are three conditions. The first is that an advisory group is set up which brings together skills, knowledge and experience from the other two ALIOs, Culture, Perth and Kinross and Live Active Leisure, alongside senior colleagues from Horsecross itself. plus senior colleagues from the council with relevant skills and expertise in venues management, marketing, programming, health and safety, finance, and so on. The council requires the Horsecross board, in order for Horsecross to access this funding, to work with the advisory group, because as I say, we would always rather work with rather than direct, except when we absolutely have to. That's the second condition, and the third condition is that Horsecross appears before Scrutiny quarterly, so in other words, at every meeting, to provide an update on improvement. One of the points I've made to you in the past is that most, if not all, public services require a level of subsidy, and the arts are no different. Horsecross significantly improved the number of attendances that it received in 2018-19. They were up to 130, just over, as you can see, 137,000 attendances last year. That's an increase of 31,000 from the year before, largely attributable, of course, to the opening of the theatre, but not entirely. It also increased the number of performances that it put on, because it had 2 venues again rather than 1. There are issues, as you can see, around catering, cost of sales minus the income that was actually generated, and employee costs have risen. At this stage, prior to the advisory group getting going and starting work with Horsecross colleagues, we're not entirely sure of the reasons for that, but it is something that needs to be looked at. Those last couple of bullet points on the slide are really worth, I think, paying attention to. So this is data and information, by the way, from Horsecross. It's information that Horsecross has given us in the past year or so. It's not our data. So you can see there that a very large proportion of tickets were sold to people who are local, our local audience. But equally, when you look at audiences as a whole, not just local audiences, 70% of them, according to Horsecross's data, only came to the theatre or the concert hall once. So there is a great opportunity there, I think, to reconnect with local audiences and increase the number of repeat visits. The objectives that we've set for the advisory group, and which I talked about with the Horsecross board when I went to their board meeting on the 3rd of June, should be simple. And this is what collectively we should be aiming for. We need to grow audiences, particularly in the theatre. You have asked questions as Scrutiny Committee in the past about how well connected the drama programme in particular in the theatre is to local audiences, and how well it reflects communities, and how well it expresses Perth and Kinross as a place, which has got lots of amazing stories to tell. So growing audiences by putting on really fantastic work is pretty fundamental in terms of addressing some of the other concerns that you have expressed in the past. The second one being efficient and financially sustainable. Part of the answer to that is by growing audiences and getting more people through the doors, but it's also about thinking around other sources of funding beyond the council, which can support Horsecross in the future, and how fundraising and diversifying income, and thinking perhaps more commercially about some aspects of service, how all of that can happen. And finally, and this goes back to where I started really, it's very important that Horsecross is transparent and accountable to taxpayers for the money that it receives. It generates a significant amount of funding, as Peter will no doubt tell you, through box office revenues, but it also receives very significant money either from ourselves or from Creative Scotland, and that's taxpayers' money. So it is right that you as a committee and that the council as a whole feel satisfied that Horsecross is performing to its utmost in delivering for the economy, you know, not forgetting that when we did the economic impact assessment on Perth Theatre before we reopened it, we estimated that it would generate an additional 1.8 million in GVA each year for the local economy. We're all very aware of the number of jobs in tourism and cultural tourism that this region sustains and depends on. So it's in everyone's interests that Horsecross is supported to improve for the future, but it's also critical that you as Scrutiny can keep track of that, hence our proposal that Scrutiny will get an update each quarter from now on how Horsecross is moving towards improvement. So I think that's all I wanted to say, Convener. I'm happy to take questions, or you may want to hear from Peter first and then take questions at the end.
I think I prefer to hear from Peter first, and then if you're both happy to take questions, we'll do all the questions at one time. Welcome, Peter. Thanks for your forbearance on the meeting. As usual, ran over a little bit, so thanks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Magnus, the chair of the board, was due to attend, so if you just pay, give me mind to just pay, I'd like to read out what he was going to say, if that's okay, and then I'll go on to some financial presentation. Thank you. Okay, so Magnus was going to say, since the last meeting, we've had discussions with the Deputy Chief Executive and the Head of Culture, the setting up of the Joint Advisory Committee. This will work with the Horsecross Board to achieve improvements in financial management, health and safety and operational management of the company. We welcome the opportunity to work closer with the Council for the benefit of Horsecross and the wider Perth and Kinross area. He wanted to report on the transformation of Horsecross operations over the last 18 months under Mike Griffiths, who stands down as Interim Chief Executive at the end of this month. Along with myself as Interim Finance Director, brought in after the sad death of Christina Mackenzie, he has stabilised the company, introduced cost savings, which has involved a reduced workforce and brought additional expertise to the board. A key part was bringing financial management under control without damaging business and creative opportunities made possible by opening the theatre and by the investment by Perth and Kinross Council, Creative Scotland and the Ganachie. The plan that was agreed by the board was to come to a balanced budget position within 3 years to allow Horsecross to develop new programming strands and rebuild audiences at the theatre. Year 18-19, which is the one we just finished, saw the projected deficit reduced from 450,000 to an expected outcome of 175,000. Since November 2018, there has been increased pressure to speed up the process to bring the company to a balanced budget by the end of March 2020. I can report on where we are, just where we are. But he wanted to make some wider points. He said, the impression has been given that Horsecross has been performing badly or performing poorly. An article appeared recently in the Dundee Courier which talked about money woes and the council stepping in. It was very damaging and did not recognise any of our genuine achievements. So here are some of them. The theatre reopened in November 2017 after 3-year, 10-month closure. So 2018 and 19, which is the year just ended, is the first full year of operating both it and the concert hall since 2013-14. We opened with a record-breaking pantomime and a 19% increase in unrestricted income over the previous year. Last week, the theatre won 2 of the prestigious National Critics Awards, Best Director, Best Ensemble for Lost at Sea, Morna Young's play about the loss of her father in a fishing tragedy, which has toured across Scotland. Last quarter's figures showed ticket attendance well up at both venues, 34,934, up on 29,493 last year's quarter, an increase of 5,441. Ticket revenue was 529,566, up on 473,186, an increase of 56,380. In community arts and creative learning, cultural performances were up 123%, cultural attendances up 91%, 2,000 participants, that's an increase of 116%, 8,000 children and young people up 85%, and 3,000 adult attendances, that's plus 68%. We worked with 15 primary schools and opportunities were offered to 30 primary schools, a significant increase on last year. And he passes on thanks to his dedicated team at Horsecross, the stakeholders and the Ganachie Trust for letting us achieve these results. He wanted to make the point that Horsecross contributes to the community, to disadvantaged groups, but particularly young people, in ways that don't make headlines but make an important contribution to the well-being of the community. He believed that working alongside the advisory committee, we could do even more. For instance, we had to cancel the very successful Southern Fried Festival because of its cost and also non-guarantee of the level of required artists. But it contributed a lot to local hotels, bed and breakfast, restaurants and bars. We might conclude that the economic benefits to the community justified the risk. We're determined to find ways of bringing it back next year. The theatre, we know we have to build audiences and we recognise it's tough after a lengthy closure. Winning awards is important, but we have to get people back in. We are a producing theatre, and that is why we get Creative Scotland grant. They are pleased with what we've done, but there's not enough of it. Our budgets do not allow us to big productions. 2- and 3-handers are our limit at present. I could go on, but would people want to hear some more, or prefer to hear me to talk about the finance?
We do get the flavour of it, and well, I do anyway, and I appreciate. I read about the Lost at Sea awards and the other accolades that you get, and obviously the benefits that are coming from it. But right at the back there, where the very start was when we said there was a 3-year plan to come up. I don't see how you can afford, how you expected to run at a deficit for 3 years if you don't have restricted reserves or any property to write it off again. So the premise of will be 3 years before we'll break even, how was the gap intended to be funded right from the very start?
If I just talk a little bit about that, because obviously I came in during the course of the last financial year. So I've done a bit of background into the organisation. So if I just give a little bit of context, and therefore hopefully that will give a sort of help to the committee. So just from my own understanding of the situation, as I say, because I came in last November. The last year that the organisation ran both the concert hall and the theatre was in 2013-14, and the underlying deficit in that year was £405,000, and had to get a substantial special grant from the council to show what at that point was a profit. Then when the theatre reopened in 17-18, again there was a substantial deficit position with, and if we take into account, if you remove the one-off VAT refund, that was at 480,000. So I guess when Mike came in, he started from a fairly difficult position because he identified in April 2018 that there was a challenging financial outlook for the year. And at that point, he agreed with the board a 3-year plan to bring the company back into a financially stable position, given it was the first year of a new operation that he had inherited. And he implemented a change management program, including some restructuring of departments and some spending controls. In November 18, that's when the requirement was brought in that it had to bring a balanced budget in by the end of this financial year, by the end of March 2020. I came in, as Magna said, because the head of finance went off sick, and then, I say sadly, died. And so in that time that I've been there, we've been implementing changes to ensure that people understood the financial situation of the organisation. When I attended the meeting on the 6th of February, I think, Kavina, you asked me what was the position, and we predicted at that point an outturn of a deficit of 188,000. So not great, I admit, but at the same time, starting from a position of probably a deficit, an underlying business model that was somewhere in the region of 450,000, it was moving in the right direction, and that's the train of action that Mike had put in place. I'm pleased to say, on the back of that, we've just finished the audit. The audit was finished, and the actual outturn was a deficit of 175,000. And as Fiona said, once you take up the opening unrestricted funds, that brings it down to 164. The audit was completely clean, and there were no management points raised. So I take comfort from the fact that we've managed to at least get ourselves and get the systems in place to ensure that the accountability, the transparency and the accountability is going in the right direction. The current situation is we've got net liabilities of 164, that's a negative reserves of 164, and Fiona is quite right, pointed out that there's a funding award with conditions attached, which of 180,000, which will help mitigate some of that, the knock-on effect of that. The first of which is cash flow management. So the cash flow, we have a cash flow the next year which is manageable, and particularly manageable with the extra £180,000. A balanced budget was agreed by the board in March of this year, subject to further review, and we are currently in action to do that to determine further cost savings. With the continued support of PKC, believe the organisation or the group is a going concern. So in light of that, I just wanted to point out that the trajectory of the organisation is a positive trajectory. Here, Horsecross Arts' income was 4.4 million this year. That's up 18% on the previous year. The trading income was 1.1 million. That's up 30% on the previous year. And the total income of 5.5 million in the first year of the new theatre is 11% higher than it was in 2013, which was the last time the organisation had to run a theatre and a concert hall at the same time. And Horsecross's earned income, that's non-subsidy, is 35% higher than it was in 13-14. But I think a key thing is the mix. So we're currently, in the year just ended, 69% of income was earned, as opposed to 57% of the income being earned the last time the organisation was running the theatre and the concert hall. So you've got the mix between, in total income, between subsidy between the two stakeholders and the amount of revenue that the organisation is earning is greater. There was a figure up there saying that catering made a loss. There was an issue, I'm glad that was pointed out, because in the draft statutory accounts it does say that catering costs are the figure that was quoted, but that actually does include conference income, conference expenditure. So the catering team, catering aspect of the business made a surplus of 10,000 when that's corrected. So what the message I'm just trying to get across, and I'm not saying it's a great financial situation at the moment, but the direction of travel is positive, in that the deficit in 2018-19 just ended is a significant improvement on the underlying positions from the 17-18 and 2013-14 positions, and it is actively being managed. So the challenges are the cash flow, the time to manage and implement the change programme, and we look forward to working with the advisory committee to help us work alongside that to identify ways of working. There are significant inflationary pressures. We're running a £5.5 million business, so if you take into account the question that was raised up there about an increased payroll, well, if you're comparing the year just ended, which is a full year of the theatre running together with the concert hall, with a year when the majority of the year it was just the concert hall, then people were taken on to manage the theatre. So one would expect the payroll budget to go up. And in fact, 75 new staff were taken on to reopen the theatre, of which 43 were on 0 hours contracts. So inflationary pressures in that area are around the increases in the national living wage, which were 4% and 5%, subsequently 5%. When you open 2 buildings rather than 1, your utilities are likely to go up, so that increased 80%, an increase of 108,000. And obviously with food inflation, there's pressure on the catering. we've lived through a period of austerity, we still are, and obviously there's been cuts in public financing and a slight reduction in the SLA funding recently. And I guess the crucial underlying issue is that we're running two buildings now and only a £200,000 increase in programming funding from Creative Scotland. So in terms of the management information improvements, which you asked about, so accurate forecasting, I think that was probably the... Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I apologise for...
The question I've got is, when they set a 3-year plan, and there must have been obvious then there was going to be a deficit in each of the first 3 years to come to the break-even point. How did the board expect to fill that funding gap?
Well, I honestly don't know the answer
because it's though they've set something, knowing that they've got no reserves to cover it, knowing that they can't legitimately write it off against an asset because they don't own any assets. So how could they pass a budget that says, I'll make up the figure, was going to run at 180,000 of a loss for 1 year when there is no way of covering it?
I guess the issue is whether it was manageable to manage that the quantum of change. But I mean, as I say, that was 6 months before I was involved with the organisation, and I don't know the answer.
But the board was still there.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I can't answer for the board because I'm...
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Fiona?
Thank you, Convener. Just some brief points, I think, just to maybe help set some of the context for the committee, and to provide some of the answer to the question that you've asked, Peter. Horsecross, at the point that it had its pre-closure funding restored by Creative Scotland, and I do think we need to put this in a broader context. Horsecross did do well from its most recent funding settlement from Creative Scotland. As Peter's rightly pointed out, there's a lot less money to go round nationally, not just locally. So Horsecross is required to prepare a 3-year business plan as part of its funding conditions with Creative Scotland. We require it to prepare a 1-year operational plan within that 3-year business plan. There was a lot of discussion with Creative Scotland and the council at the outset of that about the challenge of opening the theatre, what that meant for the organisation in terms of reconnecting with audiences and building audiences back up, not to what they had been in the period immediately before Perth Theatre closed in the winter of 2013-2014, because actually audiences had declined quite a lot at that stage, but really thinking about the theatre as a new asset and something that could bring a lot to the economy of Perth, the city of Perth. I mean, for me, I think the big lesson in this is that building a building, any building, is not just about the bricks and mortar. It is transformation and change for the organisation that's running it. And I think it is fair to say that the board has reflected quite a lot about that transformation and change, and in fairness to the board, where things might have been done differently. A couple of other points just to pick up on Peter's comments, just so that committee's got all the information it needs in front of it. It is correct that to say that there's been some significant increases in performance, and I mentioned in my introduction the increase in 31,000 overall attendances, and there have been increases in some key areas, including creative learning from last year compared with the year before. However, there are still some targets that are set by the council that Horsecross is still not meeting, and actually participants in creative learning is one of them. So whilst there is an upward trajectory, what's important, I think, from the council's perspective is that it is setting targets through the SLA which are what I would call stretching but not punishing. So they're not completely unrealistic, but they are stimulating the organisation to think about where it can do differently, more differently and better. In terms of the information around that Peter's presented around last year's figures, you know, one of our concerns, and we very much recognise that Peter has only been in the organisation for 6 months, is really the uncertainty of information. So in terms of the position in and how the organisation finished the year in 2018-19, we still want to see from Horsecross the detailed analysis of income and expenditure so that we can understand, you know, where some of the key risks to the organisation still sit, because yes, there's been really good progress in some areas, but nonetheless, as you have pointed out, Convener, there is still an underlying deficit, and the organisation working with the council needs to find a way of solving that.
Thank you, Convener. At the last Scrutiny Committee, Mike Griffiths very kindly said that there were 150 full-time equivalent jobs based, and the turnover was around about 5.5 million. So that's, Horsecross is an important part of the Perth economy. He also kindly described the importance of not just the wide range of events that are put on by Horsecross, but also talked about the community events that go on, and these are described very well in this document that's presented to us. The question I've got is there any measurement of the economic impact of that 5.5 million? Does it, you know, the multipliers and at the moment, do you have any up-to-date figures on that?
I don't, but I believe the board are very keen to have an understanding of the economic impact of because, I mean, I'm just talking from my own experience, is that when an organisation is under financial scrutiny, which perhaps understandably it should be, you can be making decisions in isolation of the impact on the rest of the wider economic landscape. So if you take, for example, Southern Fried, as the chair alluded to, you know, we made a business decision as well as there was an artistic aspect to it as well, because there was no guarantee of getting the right level of artists at that time. But you make an economic decision which has a positive impact on the bottom line for Horsecross, but it can be you may well be making a detrimental decision for the traders around, etc., etc. So I think it's very important that you have a kind of joined up thinking when you're making these kinds of decisions, because you might be giving with one and taking with another, if you know what I mean.
I think that I think that in the council we're making hard decisions all the time of where we spend our money, and the hypothetical. We're given this money to provide a service. It's known in advance. You have to make it cut, because at the same time we're cutting to children's services. We're cutting to that. We've got there's choices made all the way through, and it has to get to the situation, I think, with the advisory group, that Horsecross understands this is the end of it. I've lived through the 2013-14 debacle here, where there was a lot of money and a lot of angst, a lot of change and upheaval. I don't want to see it again. And I think we muddied the water when we start talking about David's points, that there's a whole load of things. I'm on Live Active Leisure Board. I know what the pressure we're under by, you know, the benefits that sport has as well. But we have to live within our means. Chris?
Sorry, Convener, I'm not sure I follow that.
I think what you, think what he's saying is it's costing 6 million to run a 5.5 million business.
It's not, the deficit wasn't $500,000. Okay, can I ask a question, Karina? So I'd like to thank Peter for his presentation, and for my assessment. I've listened to a few of these over the years. It's maybe something to do with numbers of people who've come to speak from Horsecross, because it's the greatest clarity I've heard about the way the organisation's moving, and it seems to me that when you're moving from a position of deficit to break even, hopefully profitability thereafter, then the pace is never as quick as you want it to be, but the numbers are moving in the right direction, it seems to me, and I think in terms of small mercies we should be grateful for that. And I think the context that's been afforded between the last time the both sites were operational is very helpful, and the improved position that we're in with the first 12 months of both facilities being open compared to the last 12 months that they're open provides some helpful context. I still push back quite forcefully on the challenge of reopening the theatre. I realise it's not a bona fide commercial organisation, but it doesn't stack up to say that it's been so challenging financially. It doesn't stack up to normal economic principles, but that's beside the point. The direction of travel, as I've said, is moving in the right direction, and I know that we're having quarterly updates from Horsecross at Scrutiny. I would like to request, maybe through yourself, and I'm sure the organisation will be very happy to oblige, is that we have very narrow and well-defined, basically as we've heard this morning, financial measures and how they are improving quarter on quarter, so that when we come to year end and closing of the accounts, there are no surprises whatsoever, because it's not unique to Horsecross, and it's not unique to the public sector to suffer from end of year myopia, where you just hope against hope that everyone's going to be okay. The way that the information's been presented to us about the financials for Horsecross today, there's no reason why we can't have that iterated every quarter at Scrutiny, and so that we, together with the board, and therefore the rest of the council, can absolutely predict where we'll be at year end. And I think, I wonder if you could see if we could have that, please.
Peter would be able to inform us if the financial controls are able to provide that, because I think Fiona said that we still didn't have clarity on how we arrived at the end of March figures.
I think just to thank you for the quick comment question, Councillor Dugan. I think to say that the intention, or to stress that the intention of the advisory group is to do exactly what you say. You know, one of the constant issues I think over the last few years has been different ways of presenting financial information, partly because there have been different personnel involved, and an uncertainty on the council's part about the veracity of the information that's being provided. So the first two priorities of the advisory group are to establish what is the baseline, where are we now, and where do we need the organisation to be, so that Scrutiny is getting regular updates on that baseline. And attached to that, Councillor Dugan and Peter and I have discussed this, it is absolutely critical that the organisation's financial systems are checked over, audited and fit for purpose. It's our understanding that Horsecross purchased an accounting system called Xero 3 years ago. I was given assurances by the then Chief Executive that that would be functional in a way that would really help the transparency of financial information. From the Council's perspective, we've not seen the progress on that we really need to see. So it's essential that the systems are well connected and are giving the people who are running the organisation the information at their fingertips to make good decisions, wise decisions about how the organisation is run. So those are our two key priorities. There are others, but the finances are certainly at the top of the list.
Just by way of a comment, Convener, it's worth pointing out, well, certainly from my perspective, that the level of scrutiny being applied to Horsecross at the moment should and must be temporary, and that following a break-even position and repeatability of that break-even position year on year, then Horsecross becomes the relatively autonomous, genuine arm's-length organisation that I'm sure Horsecross wants it to be, and I think Perth Kinross Council certainly wants it to be. So I look forward to when we're not reviewing Horsecross every quarter.
Totally concur with that. Councillor Parrott was next now.
Thank you, Peter. I'd concur with what Councillor Dugan says about a considerable degree of clarity that you gave to us there, for which thanks. I really do, I think, want us to resist looking too closely at the past. The past is gone, and we've got to move forward. We should only look at the past, I believe, where it provides context that might assist us in the future. And I think you've alluded to that. I certainly agree with the point of, I think that Fiona is making, that we need to have that detailed understanding of what is and isn't making money, event by event, and which perhaps hasn't been there before. I think also the business of wider economic benefit to the community. Put bluntly, that at the moment, in my view, is not Horsecross's concern. Horsecross have got to turn a penny. If the council wish to pay attention to the wider economic benefits and perhaps provides further subsidy to Horsecross to achieve those benefits, that's for the council to do. But in my book, Horsecross have got to be fairly, completely mercenary at the moment about what Horsecross do to turn a penny. You shake your head, David, Councillor Lingworth, but I think we'll just have to have a difference of opinion. Horsecross must concentrate on their bottom line. And one thing which we haven't said much about, frankly, at the moment is taking the piece forward and growing the audience. And I was particularly struck by the audience, the attendance figures that you presented, Fiona, because what I took from that was, in round terms, from 140,000 attendances, about 40,000 of those, 30%, were repeat attendances. So that's a smaller the number than 40,000 people coming more than once. And I wouldn't want to know whether they're coming twice or three times. But I think what's perhaps important to me there is that there are 100,000 attendances who've come once, and I don't know whether that's once in a year or over what time period. But the positive thing to that for me is that provides quite a large pool, if we know who they are, of seeking to get some of them, if not all of them, to come back again, which has to be a vital component of growing the attendances, which surely to goodness that's the biggest single thing that has to be done by providing the right programme to increase the revenue. We either increase the revenue or cut the costs, and I think the costs at the moment have been cut as far as the present programme can cover, and so the growth or the sustainability has got to come from that business of increasing the attendances.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Parrott, and Peter may want to add. The reason why I flagged that in my presentation is exactly the point that you've made. There is a huge opportunity here, and as Peter's alluded to, Horsecross has made progress, good progress since the theatre opened. There is a huge opportunity, given that 80% of audiences live locally. They live within a 30-minute drive time of the city. To build retention and loyalty, which was such a fundamental aspect, as I understand it, of Perth Theatre in particular, prior to its closure. So that's a big opportunity, but it does require more detailed analysis of customer and audience data and feedback to understand, how audiences can help Horsecross shape the programmes.
Thank you very much. Can I just concur? For those who don't know me, I was part of the re-engineering of Scottish Opera, Scottish Ballet. I was the interim chief executive of Cultural Enterprises Glasgow when they became part of Glasgow Life. So absolutely, bottom line is you have to make sure that the income and expenditure balance, you have to re-engineer and make it work. So I've been through that pain before. It's not new to me. So absolutely get that. I just wanted to pick up on something, because obviously on my watch the whole thing has been about my key drivers are accurate information, forecasting, management reporting, timely information, and system re-engineering. I mean, you know, that's exactly what I've done for the last 25 years in the arts, and latterly in cancer research. So I am surprised, but I'm more than happy to provide information if information is missing, because as I said, we sat here in February, we said the outturn would be 180,000 deficit. It was 180,000, give or take 5,000 quid deficit. So I take comfort from that. The year-end audit was completely clean. There was no issue about anything needing to be changed. So again, I take a lot of pleasure in that. The team have worked really, really hard. We produced management accounts in 15 working days from what a starting position was 25 working days. So the first set of accounts that I had to produce were the October accounts. And they were issued 25 days after that month end. We've consistently brought that down, and the last set of management accounts were produced in 15 working days, which we'd like to improve, but given it is still pretty quick given the way that you gather information after the end of the month. In the middle of all that, we've done an audit, the team. There's only 3 people in the team plus myself, so it's a relatively challenging situation, but I'm very proud of that situation. We've done a detailed budget, built it up, challenged all the budget holders, etc., and that's been undertaken. We've got that budget. We're just now working on refining it, given we've got more information now that we've had a full year end. With regard to Zero, Zero is something that I'm familiar with. I'm a Zero certified advisor. It's a very good product. It has its limitations, particularly in a large organisation. But having said that, we've redesigned the chart of accounts to make it more user-friendly. The reporting is much better. We're putting the budgets in there so we can track the budgets against actuals. We've just implemented Bank of Scotland corporate banking so that the actual processing of payroll and purchases can be done faster and more transparently. We're getting earlier data entry of transactions into Zero, so there's more real-time reporting. And we introduced invoice scanning so that when an invoice is received, it can be scanned and then presented to the accounting system. So there's been huge strides in that. We've redesigned the tracking, which means that each transaction can be matched to a budget holder and can be matched to a fund if it's restricted, or a show if you want to identify a particular show. So there's been a huge amount of change in that. It's a learning process. It's continually evolving. So the priorities, that's what we've done. But what are the key priorities to enable our stakeholders to get even better information, more timely information, etc.? First of all is the full implementation of the Bank of Scotland corporate banking. We want to improve the budget reporting further. We need to investigate the electronic interfacing with our ticketing, our EPOS, and our events management system, and the potential for doing full commitment accounting, because at the moment Zero has a purchase order aspect, but it doesn't interface with the accounting system at the moment. So we need to look to see whether there are apps out there that will enable us to do that. We're looking at building on a product called Futurely to drive KPI reporting to budget holders, and it's one of its main aspects is doing cash flow forecasting. The emphasis in all my work as a director of finance and helping the team is to try and re-engineer the finance team from being transactional based. All it is about getting a piece of paper, getting a number and getting into the system and saying, okay, how can we make that as efficient as possible so that the people who are in the finance team can then work alongside colleagues in other departments as business partners. So you're then challenging, helping, etc. And to that end, working with PKC and the advisory group to deliver financial stability, I welcome that, because actually as people understand our business better, and we understand their business better, we draw on their expertise, they draw on our expertise, then it'll be a better situation. In the meantime, we've got to try and get to a balanced position in the current financial year, and that is the ultimate challenge, I would say.
So you'll be able to bring us back with an update in September, which will be our next meeting, with hopefully the first quarter results and the budget and the year-to-date variances, etc.
Absolutely, absolutely. At the moment, we produce monthly management accounts which have month actuals against month budget and a variance. I work to a situation whereby at the end of each quarter you review the budget and produce a forecast for the outturns, because obviously you can get in-month changes. So yes, I would say working on a 15-day, sorry to interrupt, working on a 15-day working turnaround. If you have a meeting at the end of October, you'll get half-year figures.
Well, that would be good, and it would be good if perhaps, and it would save some time and that as well, if the committee could have them prior
certainly
to the meeting, and they can have a look at them, so they've got an appraisal before, because as you can appreciate, it's very hard to take in all the figures that you were given at that time without having a visual.
Appreciate that.
And I think that would be something we could learn from the next time, and I think the next time as well we'll be able to have an update from the advisory board. There's other things and I see that the advisory board are taking up with health and safety, other things that certainly concern me, that I would have thought health and safety would be an important part of what would be happening naturally without having to have an intervention from the advisory board. But I'm afraid I'm going to draw a conclusion there now, because we've been on the go for nearly 4 hours, and as long as there are questions towards the end that we're trying to achieve,
I was going to talk very briefly about the importance of this council looking at the broader economic impacts. For example, in the Winterfest.
I'm sorry, that's nothing to do with that. If you want to talk about the broader,
the question is,
David, if you want to talk about the broader impacts of that, you talk about that in your budget group, and you talk about it with what you're within your group, with what you're wanting to make of an SLA to Horsecross. That's entirely for you. The SLA is decided for this year.
So the question is really, it's to Fiona about the importance of culture. We spent a lot of time 2 years ago on the City of Culture bid, and I think we're hearing a great news story from Horsecross. I think they deliver a fantastic service, a fantastic range of events that enhance Perth and Kinross and enhance our quality of life, and that's what we need to be thinking about, the quality of life for our citizens. So my question is to Fiona about the importance of culture to Perth and Kinross.
I'm sorry. No, I don't. We're all aware of it. It's like it's irrelevant to what we're trying to find out today. We're talking about the financials of Horsecross and how they're going to improve it moving forward. The attachment we all have to culture, to sport, to everything will not affect these.
I'll very briefly answer factually, Councillor Illingworth, because you are talking about a settled policy position of the council, which is that, as the convener has pointed out, culture and sport are important policy priorities for this council. What I will say in the context of the discussion that you've just had is Horsecross undeniably, and Peter's again alluded to it, delivers wider economic benefits to the City of Perth and more widely. The general rule of thumb is that for every pound spent on culture, generally, you get about £4 back. Now that varies depending on where you are in the UK. Where I think we need to get to with Horsecross is a much more detailed and granular understanding of what they are doing that's working and what they are doing that is not working so well, and where the gap is and how there can be improvement in the areas that I've identified up there on the slide. And I think everyone is on the side of Horsecross and wants that to happen. But the bigger point I was making is that Horsecross is no more nor less accountable to this committee for its performance than any other service, whether we deliver that directly as a council service or whether we deliver it through an ALIO.
Thanks. And thank you very much for your attendance, Peter. And we do wish you all the well, but we are here to be challenging, and it will be good to see the figures in front of us before we come to the next. And I hope you and the advisory board have got even more, your further steps down the road come September. Okay, thanks. Thanks everybody else for your attendance. I'll declare the meeting closed.